Among the pantheon of Norse deities, few figures command the reverence and recognition accorded to Thor, the thunderous protector whose hammer strikes resonated across the 9 realms of Yggdrasil. His origins trace back to a union that embodied the fundamental forces governing the Norse cosmos, the marriage of divine wisdom and earthly strength that would produce the most formidable warrior god in Asgard's halls. Thor's parentage represents one of the most significant divine partnerships in Norse mythology, uniting Odin, the All-Father and supreme ruler of the Aesir, with Jord, the primordial earth goddess whose very essence permeated the soil, stone and living matter of Midgard. This union was neither accidental nor merely romantic. It constituted a deliberate cosmic arrangement designed to create a defender capable of bridging the celestial and terrestrial realms. Odin, master of wisdom, magic, and war, brought to this union his vast knowledge of runic mysteries, his command over the battlefield dead, and his position as the ultimate authority among the gods. His 8-legged steed Sleipnir could traverse all 9 worlds. His ravens Hugin and Munin gathered intelligence from across creation, and his spear Gungnir never missed its target. Jord, known also as Fjorgyn in some sources, represented the fertile, nurturing yet occasionally destructive power of the earth itself. She was not merely a personification of soil and stone, but embodied the living essence of the world's foundation, the force that caused crops to grow, mountains to rise, and earthquakes to shake the foundations of existence. Her connection to the earth ran so deep that some sources describe her as being indistinguishable from the land itself, her body forming the very ground upon which mortals and gods alike walked. When Odin sought to create a son who could serve as the ultimate guardian against the forces threatening cosmic order, his choice of Jord as mother proved both strategic and prophetic. The circumstances surrounding Thor's conception and birth carried profound implications for his future role. Unlike many divine births in Norse mythology that occurred within the golden halls of Asgard, Thor's entry into existence took place with one foot firmly planted in earthly reality. This dual heritage manifested immediately in his nature. He possessed his father's divine authority and supernatural power while maintaining an unbreakable connection to the physical world that ordinary gods sometimes struggle to understand. Where other Aesir might approach problems through cunning, magic, or political maneuvering, Thor's earthborn instincts drove him toward direct action, physical confrontation, and straightforward solutions. The prophecies surrounding Thor's birth spoke of a defender whose strength would prove essential during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods when the forces of chaos would launch their final assault against the ordered cosmos. The Norns, those ancient beings who wove the threads of fate at the base of Yggdrasil, had foreseen that the son of Odin and Jord would stand as the primary bulwark against the giants, monsters, and destructive entities that sought to return the universe to primordial chaos. These prophecies did not merely predict Thor's future actions, but established his fundamental purpose. He was born specifically to serve as the shield between order and entropy, civilization and wilderness, the known and the unknowable. Early recognition of Thor's destined role came not through gradual revelation, but through immediate, unmistakable signs of his extraordinary nature. From his first moments of life, the younger displayed strength that exceeded even veteran warriors among the Aesir. Stories tell of how his infant cries could shake the foundations of Asgard's great halls, how his first grasping movements could crush objects that would challenge grown gods, and how his presence seemed to calm the very storms that his future hammer would command. The other gods recognized these signs as confirmation of the prophecies. Here was the champion they had been promised, the defender whose arrival had been foretold since the creation of the world. Within the complex hierarchy of the Aesir pantheon, Thor occupied a position of unique prominence that reflected both his divine heritage and his prophesied destiny. While Odin reigned supreme as the All-Father, master of wisdom and ultimate authority over gods and mortals alike, Thor held the position of second most powerful deity in the Norse cosmological structure. This ranking was not merely ceremonial, but reflected genuine differences in their roles and capabilities. Where Odin's power manifested through knowledge, cunning, and magical manipulation, Thor's authority derived from raw strength, unwavering courage, and an unshakable commitment to protecting the innocent. The relationship between father and son within this hierarchy proved both complementary and occasionally complex. Odin's wisdom guided the overall strategy of divine governance. His knowledge of fate and future events informed crucial decisions, and his mastery of magic provided tools for subtle intervention in mortal and divine affairs. Thor, by contrast, served as the enforcement arm of divine will, when threats required direct confrontation rather than clever manoeuvring, when enemies needed to be faced in open battle rather than outmaneuvered through trickery. The All-Father turned to his earthborn son. This division of roles reflected deeper truths about the nature of cosmic order in Norse belief. The universe required both the subtle guidance of wisdom and the direct application of righteous force. Odin's ravens might gather intelligence about distant threats, but Thor's hammer would ultimately crush those threats when they materialized. The All-Father's political maneuvering might prevent some conflicts, but the Thunder God's willingness to face any enemy in single combat provided the ultimate guarantee of Asgard's security. Thor's position within the pantheon also carried specific responsibilities that distinguished him from other major deities. While gods like Balder embodied beauty and purity, Tyr represented honourable warfare, and Frigg governed marriage and motherhood, Thor's domain encompassed the active defence of cosmic order itself. He served not merely as a war god, but as the specific guardian against those forces that threatened to undo creation. Giants, trolls, dragons, and other monsters that sought to destroy the carefully maintained balance of the Nine Worlds found themselves facing Thor's wrath. The symbolic significance of Thor's distinctive physical appearance, particularly his famous red hair and beard, connected him directly to the elemental forces he commanded and the cosmic role he fulfilled. In Norse culture, red hair carried associations with supernatural power, fierce temperament, and connection to the other world. The colour itself evoked images of fire, blood, and the ruddy glow of dawn or sunset, all phenomena associated with power, transformation, and the boundary between different states of existence. Thor's red beard in particular held deep symbolic meaning that extended far beyond mere physical description. The beard represented masculine power, wisdom gained through experience, and the authority to speak and act on behalf of others. In Norse society, a man's beard symbolised his status, his right to participate in legal proceedings, and his role as protector of his household. For Thor, whose beard blazed with the colour of flame, these associations magnified to cosmic proportions. His facial hair became a visible manifestation of his role as protector of all creation, his authority to act on behalf of gods and mortals alike, and his connection to the primal forces of fire and lightning. The red coloration also linked Thor directly to the life-giving power of storms. When lightning split the sky, observers saw reflected in those brilliant flashes the same fiery hue that marked the thunder god's appearance. The ruddy light of his hair and beard seemed to capture and contain the essential nature of the electrical forces he commanded. This was not mere coincidence, but reflected the Norse understanding that physical appearance often revealed deeper spiritual truths. Thor's red hair announced his nature as surely as his mighty hammer proclaimed his strength. Furthermore, the colour red connected Thor to the fertilising power of storms and the life-giving properties of rain. While lightning might destroy, the storms that Thor commanded ultimately brought the moisture necessary for crops, the electrical charges that enrich soil, and the dramatic weather patterns that mark the changing seasons. His red hair thus symbolised not only destructive power but creative force, the ability to clear away the old and make space for new growth. The symbolic connections extended to fire itself. that fundamental element that separated civilization from wilderness, cooked food from raw and light from darkness. Thor's red hair marked him as master of controlled fire, not the wild, destructive flames that consumed forests and buildings, but the disciplined fire that served human needs and divine purposes. His connection to both lightning and beneficial fire made him a bridge between the awesome, untamed forces of nature and the controlled power that sustained civilized life. The divine armaments that Thor wielded in his eternal struggle against the forces of chaos represented far more than mere weapons or tools. They constituted extensions of his very essence, crafted through supernatural means and imbued with properties that defied the natural laws governing both divine and mortal realms. Among these artifacts, none commanded greater reverence or inspired more terror in the hearts of his enemies than Mjolnir, the hammer whose creation story reveals the intricate web of divine politics, dwarven craftsmanship, and cosmic necessity that shaped the most powerful weapon in Norse mythology. The origins of Mjolnir trace back to one of Loki's most consequential acts of mischief, an incident that began as a seemingly harmless prank but ultimately resulted in the creation of several of the most powerful artifacts in the Norse pantheon. The trouble started when Loki, driven by his characteristic blend of curiosity and malevolence, crept into the sleeping chambers of Sif, Thor's beloved wife, and severed her magnificent golden hair while she slumbered. This hair was not ordinary by any measure. It flowed like spun sunlight, caught and reflected the rays of dawn and dusk, and was considered one of the most beautiful sights in all of Asgard. When Sif awoke to discover her loss, her anguish echoed through the halls of the gods, and Thor's rage shook the very foundations of the divine realm. Faced with his stepbrother's volcanic fury and the prospect of consequences that might literally tear Asgard apart, Loki found himself compelled to seek a solution that would restore Sif's beauty and placate Thor's wrath. His search led him deep beneath the mountains of Midgard, into the labyrinthine workshops and forges of Svartalfheim, the realm of the dark elves and dwarves whose mastery of metalworking and enchantment exceeded that of any other beings in the 9 worlds. These craftsmen possessed the knowledge and skill necessary to work with materials that existed nowhere else in creation. Metals that held starlight, stones that contained the essence of time itself, and alloys that could channel the fundamental forces of the cosmos. In the workshops of the sons of Ivaldi, master craftsmen whose reputation for creating impossible things had spread throughout the realms, Loki commissioned not only a replacement for Sif's hair, but additional gifts that might further appease the gods he had offended. The dwarves spun hair from the finest gold, each strand thinner than spider silk yet stronger than iron chains, and wove it into locks that would grow upon Sif's head and shine more brilliantly than her original tresses. But their creative fervour, once ignited, could not be easily contained. They also crafted Gungnir, the spear destined for Odin that would never miss its target and always return to its wielder's hand, and Skidbladnir, a ship for Freyr that could sail through air and water alike while folding small enough to fit in a pouch when not needed. Loki's satisfaction with these magnificent creations proved short-lived, however, as his boastful nature compelled him to proclaim throughout Svartalfheim that the sons of Ivaldi were the greatest craftsmen who had ever lived. This declaration reached the ears of 2 other mastersmiths, the brothers Atri and Brokkr, whose pride in their own abilities would not allow such a claim to pass unchallenged. These brothers, whose forge burned with fires that had consumed the hearts of the dying stars, whose hammers rang with the music of creation itself, and whose knowledge of metallurgy encompassed secrets learned from the earliest days of the cosmos, demanded the opportunity to prove their superior skill. The challenge that emerged from this rivalry would reshape the balance of power among the gods and provide Thor with a weapon that would define his legendary status throughout the ages. Loki, ever the gambler and schemer, proposed a wager that would pit the 2 sets of craftsmen against each other in a contest of skill and imagination. The sons of Ivaldi had already demonstrated their mastery with their 3 remarkable creations, but Eitri and Broker claimed they could craft 3 artifacts that would surpass even these marvels. The stakes of the wager reflected the magnitude of the challenge. If the brothers succeeded in creating superior works, they would claim Loki's head as their prize. The brothers accepted this challenge with the confidence of master craftsmen who had never known defeat in their chosen field. They began their work with Gullinbursti, a boar for Freyr whose golden bristles could illuminate the darkest corners of any realm, and whose speed surpassed that of any horse, whether earthly or divine. The creature's hide gleamed like burnished metal, each bristle individually forged and enchanted to emit light that could guide travellers through the most treacherous paths or reveal enemies hiding in ambush. Their second creation was Draupnir, a golden arm ring destined for Odin that possessed the remarkable property of creating 8 identical rings of equal weight and purity every 9th night. This was not mere multiplication of precious metal, but a manifestation of the principle of abundance itself, ensuring that the All-Father would never lack for wealth to distribute among his followers or to offer as gifts to secure alliances and obligations. For their final and most ambitious project, the brothers turned their attention to crafting a weapon for Thor that would embody the very essence of thunder and lightning while serving as an instrument of divine justice. They began with metals that existed nowhere else in creation: iron that had been forged in the heart of a dying star, silver that had been blessed by the light of the first dawn, and gold that contained the concentrated power of 1,000 lightning strikes. These materials were heated in fires that burned hotter than the core of any sun, worked with hammers that had been blessed by the Norns themselves, and shaped according to patterns that had been revealed in prophetic dreams. But Loki, watching the brothers' progress and growing increasingly concerned about the potential loss of his head, could not resist interfering with their work. As Eitri worked the bellows that kept their supernatural forge burning at the precise temperature necessary for their delicate work, Loki transformed himself into a fly and began stinging the dwarf repeatedly, trying to disrupt his concentration and rhythm. The first stings, delivered while Eitri worked on Gullinbursti, caused minor disruptions but did not significantly affect the final product. The second set of attacks during the creation of Draupnir proved similarly ineffective against the dwarf's determination and skill. However, when the brothers began the final and most critical phase of Mjolnir's creation, Loki's interference achieved a consequence that would mark the hammer for all eternity. As Eitri worked the bellows during the crucial moments when the hammer's handle was being forged and attached to its head, Loki delivered a particularly vicious sting directly to the dwarf's eyelid, causing him to blink and momentarily lose his rhythm. This brief interruption in the bellow's steady flow caused the fires to fluctuate just enough to affect the handle's final length. When the brothers completed their work and examined their creation, they discovered that while the hammer's head was perfect in every respect, its handle had been shortened by several inches, making it less comfortable to wield than they had originally intended. Despite this flaw, Mjolnir emerged from the brothers' forge as the most powerful weapon ever created, its supernatural properties more than compensating for the inconvenience of its shortened grip. The hammer's head, forged from the concentrated essence of thunder itself, possessed the ability to strike with the force of the mightiest storms. When Thor hurled it at his enemies, it flew with the speed of lightning, its passage through the air accompanied by the sound of rolling thunder that announced the thunder god's presence to all within hearing. The weapon's supernatural accuracy meant that it would never miss its intended target, regardless of distance, obstacles, or the evasive maneuvers of those who sought to escape its devastating impact. The hammer's most remarkable property, however, was its unwavering loyalty to its wielder. No matter how far Thor might hurl Mjolnir in battle, no matter what obstacles might lie between the weapon and its master, the hammer would always return to his outstretched hand with the same speed and force with which it had been thrown. This return journey often proved as destructive as the initial strike, as enemies who thought themselves safe after dodging the hammer's first pass found themselves facing its devastating power a second time as it carved a path back to Thor's waiting grasp. The destructive capabilities of Mjolnir extended far beyond its use against individual enemies. When wielded with Thor's full strength, the hammer could level mountains, split the earth itself, and create craters that would remain as permanent scars upon the landscape for countless generations. The weapon's impact against the ground could trigger earthquakes that toppled the mightiest fortresses, while its collision with bodies of water could create tsunamis that reshaped coastlines and flooded entire regions. These were not merely the exaggerated claims of myth makers, but reflected the genuine cosmic significance of a weapon designed to serve as the ultimate deterrent against forces that threatened the stability of all creation. The hammer's supernatural properties also extended to its ability to consecrate and bless. When Thor raised Mjolnir during ceremonies, its presence sanctified marriages, blessed newborn children, and consecrated the construction of new settlements. The same weapon that could destroy armies and level fortifications could also serve as an instrument of divine approval and protection, marking the dual nature of Thor's role as both destroyer of enemies and protector of the innocent. Yet for all its incredible power, Mjolnir remained merely one component of Thor's complete arsenal of divine artifacts. The hammer's tremendous weight and the forces it channeled required additional equipment to enable even the Thunder God to wield it effectively and safely. The most crucial of these supplementary items was his belt of strength, known as Mjolnir, a masterwork of divine craftsmanship that doubled Thor's already immense physical power when fastened around his waist. Mjolnir was not merely a belt in the conventional sense, but represented a sophisticated piece of divine technology that interfaced directly with Thor's supernatural physiology. Crafted from materials that existed only in the realm of the gods, the belt contained within its structure a complex network of enchantments and power-focusing elements that could channel and amplify the natural strength that flowed through Thor's divine form. When he girded himself with Mjolnir before battle, the belt's magic interacted with his earthborn heritage and divine nature to create a synergistic effect that elevated his physical capabilities to truly cosmic levels. The belt's appearance reflected its functional sophistication. Rather than simple leather or metal, Mjolnir was constructed from interwoven strands of divine energy given a physical form, creating a flexible yet incredibly durable band that could withstand the tremendous forces generated when Thor's strength reached its peak levels. The belt's surface bore intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as power flowed through them, creating a visual representation of the magical energies at work within its structure. When Thor donned Mjolnir, the transformation in his capabilities was immediately apparent to any observer. His already impressive physical presence seemed to expand and intensify. His movements carried greater authority and power, and the very air around him seemed to thicken with barely contained energy. The belt's power amplification was not merely additive, but multiplicative, taking Thor's natural strength and doubling it through magical enhancement that reached into the fundamental forces that governed physical reality. This enhanced strength proved essential not only for wielding Mjolnir effectively, but for the full range of Thor's responsibilities as defender of the cosmos. When facing giants whose size dwarfed mountains, when battling sea serpents whose coils could encircle entire islands, or when confronting dragons whose scales could turn aside ordinary weapons, Thor needed every advantage that his divine artifacts could provide. Mjolnir ensured that his physical strength could match the scale of the threats he faced. Equally important to Thor's ability to wield his mighty hammer were his iron gloves, known as Jerngriper, which provided the necessary interface between his divine hands and Mjolnir's supernatural properties. These gloves were not simple protective gear, but represented another masterpiece of divine craftsmanship, specifically designed to enable Thor to grasp and control a weapon whose power could otherwise prove too much, even for divine physiology to handle safely. The creation of Jerngriper required iron that had been specially treated and enchanted to withstand the tremendous forces generated when Mjolnir was wielded at full power. This iron was not mined from earthly deposits, but harvested from meteorites that had fallen from the cosmic void, carrying within their metallic structure the concentrated essence of stellar fire and the cold emptiness of space. The dwarven smiths who forged these gloves subjected this celestial iron to processes that transformed its fundamental nature, creating a material that could channel divine power without being destroyed by the forces flowing through it. The glove's internal structure incorporated a complex system of enchantments that served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided the necessary grip strength to hold Mjolnir securely during the most violent combat. They protected Thor's hands from the weapon's supernatural heat and electrical discharge, and they served as focusing elements that helped direct the hammer's power with maximum precision and effect. Without Jerngriper, even Thor's divine constitution would be insufficient to wield Mjolnir safely over extended periods. The relationship between Thor and his three primary artifacts, Mjolnir, Megingjord, and Jerngriper, transcended mere ownership or utilitarian function. These items had been specifically created or chosen to complement his unique nature as the son of Odin and Jord, and their combined power reflected the cosmic role he was destined to fulfill. The hammer provided the offensive capability necessary to destroy threats to cosmic order. The belt supplied the enhanced strength required to face enemies of truly massive scale, and the gloves enabled him to channel these forces with the precision necessary to protect innocents while annihilating enemies. Together, these artifacts transformed Thor from merely a powerful god into the ultimate guardian of creation itself. When fully equipped with all three items, he became a force of nature that could stand against any threat, whether it emerged from the chaotic realms beyond the ordered cosmos or arose from within the nine worlds themselves. The shortened handle of Mjolnir, which might have seemed like a flaw, actually proved advantageous in many combat situations, allowing for quicker strikes and more agile maneuvering, while the belt's strength enhancement compensated for any loss of leverage. The psychological impact of these artifacts extended far beyond their practical applications in combat. When enemies saw Thor approaching with Mjolnir in his iron-gloved hands, his strength doubled by Megingjord. They understood that they faced not merely a powerful opponent, but the personification of divine justice itself. The sight of these legendary artifacts served as both warning and promise. Warning to those who threatened the innocent, and promise to those who looked to the gods for protection against the forces of chaos and destruction that constantly pressed against the boundaries of the ordered world. The divine household that Thor established represented one of the most significant family structures within the Aesir pantheon, centered around his marriage to Sif, the golden-haired goddess whose beauty and symbolic importance extended far beyond mere physical attraction. Sif's most distinctive feature, her magnificent hair that flowed like liquid sunlight, held profound agricultural and seasonal symbolism that connected her directly to the fertility cycles governing mortal existence. Her locks represented the golden grain fields that swayed in summer breezes, the wheat that sustained human civilization, and the cyclical nature of harvest and renewal that marked the passage of years in Midgard. The union between Thor and Sif embodied a fundamental cosmic principle that governed Norse understanding of natural forces and divine responsibility. Where Thor commanded the storms that brought both destruction and life-giving rain, Sif personified the Earth's receptive capacity to transform that moisture into abundant crops. Their marriage represented the essential partnership between sky and earth, between the dramatic weather patterns that Thor controlled and the quiet, steady growth processes that Sif oversaw. This was not merely a romantic pairing, but a theological statement about the interdependence of natural forces. Sif's role extended beyond symbolic representation into active participation in the divine governance of agricultural cycles. She possessed intimate knowledge of soil conditions, seasonal timing, and the delicate balance of factors that determined whether harvests would be abundant or meagre. Farmers throughout the Norse lands offered prayers and sacrifices to both Thor and Sif, understanding that successful agriculture required both the thunder god's storms and his wife's blessing upon the growing grain. Her presence in Thor's household ensured that his tremendous power remained connected to the practical needs of mortal communities. The goddess's influence upon Thor himself proved equally significant in shaping his character and priorities. While his earthborn nature already inclined him toward protecting human settlements and agricultural communities, Sif's presence reinforced and refined these protective instincts. Through their daily interactions, she reminded him constantly of the fragile nature of mortal existence and the careful attention required to maintain the conditions that allowed civilization to flourish. Her gentle guidance helped temper his sometimes overwhelming enthusiasm for direct confrontation with more nuanced understanding of when restraint served better than action. Their marriage also established Thor as a settled, responsible member of divine society, rather than merely a wandering warrior. The domestic stability that Sif provided created a foundation from which he could venture forth on his various adventures and campaigns, while always maintaining a connection to the ordered, civilized world he fought to protect. Their household in Asgard became a gathering place for other gods seeking Thor's counsel or assistance, and Sif's role as hostess helped maintain the diplomatic relationships necessary for effective cooperation among the Aesir. The children born from Thor's various relationships represented the continuation of his divine lineage and the perpetuation of his protective role into future generations. His sons, Modi and Magni, born to different mothers but both carrying their father's essential nature, embodied specific aspects of Thor's power that would prove crucial during the cosmic upheavals of Ragnarok. These were not merely offspring, but carefully planned extensions of Thor's divine function, each equipped with particular abilities that complemented their father's role as defender of cosmic order. Modi, whose name meant wrath or courage, inherited his father's fierce temperament and unwavering determination to face any enemy regardless of the odds. From his earliest years, he displayed an aggressive nature that surpassed even Thor's legendary readiness for battle. Where his father might sometimes pause to consider strategy or seek counsel from other gods, Modi's instincts drove him toward immediate, overwhelming response to any perceived threat. His courage bordered on recklessness, but this apparent flaw actually represented a crucial quality that would serve him well during the final battles when hesitation could prove fatal. The young god's physical development reflected his inherited divine nature, with strength that grew at an accelerated pace even by divine standards. Training sessions with his father became legendary among the Aesir for their intensity and the damage they inflicted upon the practice grounds. Modi's eagerness to test himself against increasingly powerful opponents drove him to seek out challenges that other gods might consider excessive or unnecessary, but these experiences prepared him for the ultimate trials that awaited him. Magni, whose name signified strength, represented a different aspect of Thor's nature, the raw physical power that could accomplish seemingly impossible feats through sheer force of will and muscular capability. Even as a child, Magni demonstrated strength that amazed even veteran warriors among the gods. Stories circulated throughout Asgard of how the young god could lift boulders that challenged grown Aesir, how his grip could crush iron implements, and how his presence seemed to stabilize structures that were beginning to weaken or collapse. The most famous demonstration of Magni's extraordinary strength occurred during one of Thor's battles with the giant Hrungnir, when the thunder god found himself pinned beneath the massive stone leg of his defeated enemy. None of the assembled Aesir could lift the enormous limb to free their champion, despite their combined efforts and various attempts to use leverage and magical assistance. Magni, still a child at the time, approached the seemingly impossible task and casually lifted the giant's leg with one hand, freeing his father and demonstrating strength that exceeded that of all the other gods combined. This incident established Magni's reputation as the strongest being in Asgard, and confirmed the prophecies that spoke of his survival beyond Ragnarok. The ease with which he accomplished what had defeated the combined efforts of multiple gods suggested that his power would continue growing throughout his development, potentially reaching levels that surpassed even Thor's enhanced capabilities. His destiny as one of the few gods who would survive the twilight of the gods and help rebuild the world afterward reflected the essential nature of strength as a force that endures beyond temporary destructions and setbacks. Both Modi and Magni received training not only in combat techniques and the use of divine weapons, but in the broader responsibilities that came with their inherited role as protectors. Thor ensured that his sons understood the difference between strength used for its own sake and power wielded in service of justice and order. They learned to recognize the signs of genuine threats to cosmic stability, to distinguish between enemies who required destruction and opponents who might be converted or contained, and to appreciate the delicate balance that maintained peace between the various realms and peoples of the Norse cosmos. The relationship between the two brothers developed along lines that complemented their individual natures while preparing them for their shared destiny. Modi's fierce courage provided the initiative and determination necessary to engage threats before they could fully manifest, while Magni's overwhelming strength supplied the raw power needed to overcome enemies once battle was joined. Their cooperation in training exercises and minor adventures demonstrated the effectiveness of their combined abilities and suggested that their partnership would prove crucial during the final battles. Thor's daughter Thruda represented yet another aspect of his divine nature, embodying the concept of divine strength in its most refined and purposeful form. Her name, meaning strength or power, indicated her inheritance of her father's most essential quality, but her development as a goddess revealed how that strength could manifest in forms beyond mere physical force. Thruda possessed not only impressive physical capabilities, but also the wisdom to apply her power with precision and restraint when circumstances required subtlety rather than overwhelming force. Unlike her brothers, whose destinies lay primarily in warfare and the defense of cosmic order through combat, Thruda's role encompassed the broader application of divine strength to the challenges of governance, diplomacy, and the maintenance of justice in peacetime. Her presence in Asgard's halls provided Thor with a different perspective on the use of power, one that emphasized the importance of knowing when not to act as much as when to strike with full force. Her counsel helped balance his natural inclination toward direct action with consideration of longer-term consequences and alternative approaches. The goddess's beauty, which rivaled that of any deity in the Norse pantheon, served not merely as a physical attribute but as a manifestation of the harmony that resulted when strength was properly directed and controlled. Her appearance reflected the principle that true power, when wielded with wisdom and restraint, created rather than destroyed, built up rather than tore down, and inspired rather than intimidated. Suitors from across the Nine Realms sought her hand in marriage, recognizing that union with Thruda would bring not only personal happiness, but alliance with one of the most powerful divine bloodlines. However, Thor's protective nature regarding his daughter created complications for potential suitors that went far beyond the normal challenges of courtship. Any being who wished to marry Thruda faced the prospect of convincing not only the goddess herself, but also her father, whose standards for acceptable sons-in-law reflected his cosmic responsibilities and his intimate knowledge of the threats that constantly menaced the ordered world. Suitors needed to demonstrate not merely wealth, status, or even courage, but the specific qualities that would make them suitable partners for a goddess whose strength would be needed during the approaching twilight of the gods. The complex relationship between Thor and his half-brother Loki represented one of the most fascinating and ultimately tragic dynamics within the Norse pantheon, evolving from early companionship and mutual respect through growing tension to eventual bitter enmity that would contribute to the cosmic catastrophe of Ragnarok. Their association began in the early days of Asgard's establishment, when Loki's cunning and Thor's strength complemented each other in ways that benefited both gods and enhanced their effectiveness in dealing with various threats and challenges. During their early adventures together, Loki's intellectual gifts and talent for creative problem-solving provided solutions to obstacles that Thor's direct approach could not overcome, while Thor's unwavering courage and tremendous physical power enabled them to survive situations that Loki's cleverness had gotten them into. Their partnership proved particularly effective when dealing with giants and other enemies who combined physical threats with cunning strategies, requiring both intellectual and physical responses to achieve victory. The famous journey to Utgard, the giant stronghold, exemplified both the strengths and the underlying tensions in their relationship. When the giant king Utgard Loki challenged the visiting gods to contests that seemed designed to humiliate them, Thor's competitive nature drove him to accept challenges that tested his strength, appetite, and speed. His apparent failures in these contests, being unable to drain a drinking horn, failing to lift a seemingly ordinary cat, and losing a wrestling match to an elderly woman, initially appeared to validate the giant's mockery of Aesir capabilities. Loki's participation in these same contests, where his own apparent defeats in eating and running competitions seemed to confirm the visitor's inadequacy, created a shared experience of frustration and apparent humiliation. However, the revelation that these contests had been rigged through magical illusions, that Thor had been drinking from a horn connected to the ocean, attempting to lift the Midgard serpent disguised as a cat, and wrestling against the personification of old age itself, transformed their understanding of what had occurred. This adventure demonstrated both the value of their partnership and the seeds of future conflict. Thor's willingness to face any challenge, regardless of the apparent impossibility of success, earned respect even from their giant hosts, while Loki's quick understanding of the deceptions involved helped them recognize the true nature of what they had experienced. Yet the incident also highlighted their fundamental differences in approach and values, Thor's straightforward honesty versus Loki's appreciation for clever deception, the Thunder God's preference for direct confrontation against the shapeshifter's comfort with ambiguous situations. As their relationship developed over countless adventures and shared experiences, these underlying differences gradually created friction that would eventually overshadow their early compatibility. Thor's growing reputation as the primary defender of Asgard and the most reliable champion of cosmic order contrasted sharply with Loki's increasing involvement in schemes that, while often ultimately beneficial, created chaos and uncertainty in their immediate aftermath. The Thunder God's straightforward nature found it increasingly difficult to tolerate his half-brother's tendency to create problems that required elaborate solutions. The incident involving Sif's hair, which led to the creation of Mjolnir and other divine artifacts, exemplified the pattern that characterized their relationship during its middle period. Loki's mischievous act created a serious problem that threatened Thor's domestic happiness and potentially his marriage, but the shapeshifter's efforts to make amends ultimately resulted in benefits that exceeded the original harm. Thor received his legendary hammer, Odin acquired his perfect spear, and other gods gained powerful artifacts that enhanced their capabilities. Yet even this seemingly positive outcome carried undertones of the future conflict that would eventually destroy their brotherhood. Thor's rage at the discovery of Sif's loss had been genuine and overwhelming, requiring significant effort from other gods to prevent him from immediately executing Loki before the shapeshifter could attempt to make amends. The incident demonstrated that certain boundaries existed in their relationship that Loki crossed at his peril, while also revealing the extent to which Thor's protective instincts extended to his immediate family. The fundamental antagonism between the Aesir gods and the Jotnar giants represented far more than simple territorial disputes or personal vendettas. It constituted the central organizing principle of Norse cosmology, an eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos that had shaped the universe since its creation and would continue until its ultimate destruction at Ragnarok. This cosmic conflict found its most vivid and decisive expression in Thor's countless battles against giant kind, encounters that served simultaneously as military campaigns, theological statements, and essential maintenance work for the stability of all 9 worlds. The origins of this enmity stretched back to the earliest moments of creation, when the gods fashioned the ordered cosmos from the body of the primordial giant Ymir. This foundational act of divine violence established the pattern that would define relations between the 2 races throughout their shared history. The giants, as descendants and spiritual heirs of Ymir, carried within their very essence the chaotic, undifferentiated potential that had characterized the universe before the gods imposed structure, boundaries, and meaning upon existence. Their continued presence represented a constant reminder of what the cosmos had been and a perpetual threat of what it might become again if divine vigilance ever faltered. From the giants' perspective, the gods had committed an act of cosmic theft, stealing their ancestors' body to create a universe that served divine purposes while relegating giant kind to the harsh, marginal regions beyond the boundaries of civilized existence. Jotunheim, their primary realm, consisted largely of wilderness, rocky wastes, and forbidding mountains where survival required constant struggle against hostile elements. This geographical marginalization reflected and reinforced their position as outsiders to the cosmic order, beings whose very nature placed them in opposition to the principles of stability, predictability, and controlled growth that the gods sought to maintain. Yet the relationship between gods and giants proved far more complex than simple mutual antagonism. Intermarriage between the 2 races occurred regularly, with many gods taking giant wives or husbands, and the resulting offspring often possessed qualities that combined divine order with giant strength or wisdom. Odin himself had giant ancestry through his mother Bestla, and his marriage to the giant Jord had produced Thor, whose earthborn heritage proved essential to his role as defender of the cosmos. These connections created networks of kinship and obligation that complicated what might otherwise have been straightforward warfare. The giants themselves displayed tremendous diversity in their nature, capabilities, and relationship to the cosmic order. Some, like the wise Mimir or the prophetic Vafthrudnir, possessed knowledge that even the gods sought and respected. Others, such as the sea giant Aegir, maintained generally peaceful relations with Asgard and regularly hosted the gods at elaborate feasts. The frost giants of Jotunheim pursued their own complex society with its own laws, customs, and internal conflicts, while mountain giants focused primarily on their ancient feuds and territorial disputes with neighbouring clans. However, certain categories of giants posed such fundamental threats to cosmic stability that they required active suppression regardless of any personal relationships or diplomatic considerations. These were the giants whose very existence worked to undermine the boundaries and distinctions that maintained the ordered universe, beings whose power grew through consuming or corrupting the structures that held the 9 worlds in proper relationship to each other. Thor's role as giant slayer focused primarily on these cosmic threats, though his protective instincts often drove him to intervene in conflicts that involve lesser dangers to mortal populations. The Thunder God's approach to giant fighting reflected both his straightforward nature and his deep understanding of the cosmic principles at stake in these encounters. Unlike other gods who might attempt to negotiate, trick, or outmaneuver giant opponents, Thor typically sought direct confrontation that would resolve conflicts through decisive application of overwhelming force. This strategy proved particularly effective against giants whose power derived from their ability to spread chaos and uncertainty, as Thor's direct attacks forced them to respond on terms that favoured divine order over primordial chaos. His battle against Hrungnir, the strongest of all giants, exemplified both the personal and cosmic dimensions of Thor's giant fighting campaigns. Hrungnir possessed strength that rivaled Thor's own, weapons crafted from materials that existed nowhere else in the Nine Worlds, and a reputation for invincibility that had remained unchallenged throughout his long existence. The giant's body was constructed entirely of stone. His heart was made of sharp-edged flint, and his massive shield and club were hewn from the same impenetrable rock that formed the foundations of the tallest mountains. The conflict began when Hrungnir, boasting of his capabilities while visiting Asgard under a pledge of safe conduct, claimed that he could single-handedly destroy the god's stronghold and carry off Freyr and Sif as prizes. These boasts, delivered in the very halls of the gods while under their protection, represented more than mere drunken bragging. They constituted a direct challenge to the cosmic order that the Aesir had established and maintained. Thor's absence during these provocations prevented immediate retaliation, but when he returned to discover what had transpired, his rage shook the very foundations of Asgard. The Thunder God's challenge to single combat placed both participants in a position where retreat would mean permanent loss of honour and authority. Hrungnir, despite his boasts, understood the genuine danger that Thor represented, but his reputation among giant kind depended upon his willingness to face any opponent regardless of the odds. The site chosen for their duel, the border between Asgard and Jotunheim, symbolised the cosmic significance of their encounter. This would be a battle that determined the relative strength of order and chaos in their eternal struggle for dominance. Hrungnir's preparations for the battle revealed both his formidable capabilities and the support he commanded among his fellow giants. They constructed a massive clay giant named Mokud Kalfi to serve as his companion in battle, a creature so large that its creation required the combined efforts of dozens of giant craftsmen working for days to shape and animate its enormous form. This artificial warrior stood 9 leagues tall, with a breadth of 3 leagues across the chest, but the giants could find no heart large enough to animate such a massive frame except that of a mare, which left their creation powerful but cowardly. The actual confrontation between Thor and Hrungnir demonstrated the Thunder God's tactical intelligence as well as his raw power. Rather than engaging in the straightforward melee that the giant expected, Thor hurled Mjolnir at his opponent from a distance that maximised the hammer's devastating impact, while minimising his own exposure to Hrungnir's stone weapons. The giant, recognising the approach of the legendary hammer, responded by hurling his massive whetstone club with all his strength, hoping to intercept or deflect Thor's weapon before it could reach him. The collision between Mjolnir and the giant's club created one of the most spectacular displays of raw power ever witnessed in the Nine Worlds. The impact shattered Hrungnir's stone weapon into countless fragments that scattered across multiple realms, with some pieces embedding themselves so deeply in the earth that they became permanent features of the landscape. The largest fragment struck Thor in the forehead, lodging there despite his divine constitution and creating a wound that would trouble him for years afterward. Despite this injury, Mjolnir continued its flight and struck Hrungnir squarely in the skull, crushing the giant's stone head and sending his massive body crashing to the ground with such force that the impact created a crater that remained visible for centuries. However, the giant's death created an unexpected problem. His enormous leg fell across Thor's body, pinning the Thunder God beneath its tremendous weight while he lay unconscious from his head wound. The assembled gods, rushing to assist their champion, found themselves unable to lift Hrungnir's massive limb despite their combined efforts and various attempts to use leverage, magic, and mechanical assistance. The stone leg seemed to have acquired additional weight from its owner's death, as if the giant's final act had been to ensure that his defeat would cost his slayer dearly. For 3 days, Thor remained trapped beneath the crushing weight, while the gods debated various rescue strategies and sought magical solutions to their dilemma. The resolution came through the unexpected intervention of Magni, Thor's young son, who approached the seemingly impossible task with the casual confidence of youth. The child grasped the giant's leg and lifted it effortlessly with one hand, freeing his father and demonstrating strength that exceeded the combined efforts of all the assembled gods. This feat established Magni's reputation throughout the 9 worlds and confirmed the prophecies that spoke of his survival beyond Ragnarok to help rebuild the cosmos after its destruction. Thor's battle against the giant Geirrodr and his daughters represented a different type of threat that required not only physical prowess but tactical awareness and the ability to recognize and counter magical deceptions. Geirrodr ruled over a domain that existed partially outside normal space and time, a realm where the usual laws governing divine and mortal existence operated according to principles that served the giant's malevolent purposes. His daughters, Gjalp and Greip, possessed magical abilities that complemented their father's power and made their mountain stronghold nearly impregnable to conventional assault. The encounter began when Loki, captured during one of his shape-shifting adventures, found himself imprisoned in Geirrodr's hall under circumstances that revealed the giant's knowledge of divine politics and his understanding of how to exploit the relationships between different gods. The giant's demands for Loki's release included a requirement that Thor visit his stronghold without his 3 primary artifacts, Mjolnir, Megingjord, and Jarngripa, essentially demanding that the Thunder God enter hostile territory stripped of the weapons and equipment that defined his identity as Cosmic Defender. This demand revealed Geirrodr's sophisticated understanding of Thor's nature and the sources of his power. The giant recognized that Thor's strength, while formidable, derived much of its effectiveness from the synergistic interaction between his divine heritage and his legendary artifacts. By forcing the Thunder God to approach without these tools, Geirrodr hoped to reduce him to a more manageable level of threat, while still maintaining the technical requirements of hospitality and honor that governed such encounters. However, Thor's journey to Geirrodr's domain received unexpected assistance from the giantess Grida, a figure whose complex relationship to both divine and giant society exemplified the intricate web of alliances and obligations that complicated the eternal war between the 2 races. Grida had borne a son to Odin and maintained friendly relations with several gods despite her giant heritage, creating a personal stake in Thor's survival that transcended simple racial loyalty. The giantess provided Thor with a replacement set of equipment that, while not matching the power of his usual artifacts, offered sufficient enhancement to his natural abilities to make the upcoming confrontation more balanced. Her staff, belt, and iron gloves possessed their own magical properties that complemented Thor's divine nature and provided him with tools specifically designed to counter the types of threats he would face in Geirrodr's domain. The approach to Geirrodr's stronghold required Thor to navigate a series of supernatural obstacles that tested different aspects of his capabilities and resolve. The giant's daughters attempted to drown him by urinating into the river he was crossing, creating a flood that threatened to sweep even his enhanced strength away. This crude but effective attack demonstrated the giant's willingness to use any means necessary to achieve their goals, regardless of conventional notions of honor or dignity in combat. Thor's response to this challenge revealed both his tactical intelligence and his ability to adapt divine power to unexpected situations. Rather than attempting to fight against the flood through raw strength, he grasped the rowan tree growing beside the river and used it as an anchor point that allowed him to maintain his position while the magical waters raged around him. His success in overcoming this obstacle established a pattern for the encounters that followed. Each challenge required not merely power, but the wisdom to apply that power in creative and effective ways. The final confrontation in Geirrodr's hall presented Thor with opponents who combined physical strength with magical abilities and intimate knowledge of their own domain's supernatural properties. The giant's daughters attacked simultaneously, using their size and magical powers to create a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed most opponents. Their strategy relied on their ability to manipulate the physical environment of their father's hall, turning familiar objects into weapons and creating obstacles that channeled Thor's movements in directions that served their tactical purposes. Thor's victory in this encounter required him to use Gridr's staff as both weapon and tool, employing it to brace himself against the ceiling when the giant's daughters attempted to crush him by lifting his chair, then driving it through both their bodies with a single thrust that demonstrated his ability to generate tremendous force even without Mjolnir's assistance. The deaths of Gjálp and Greip eliminated Geirrodr's primary magical support and left the giant himself vulnerable to direct confrontation. The giant's final gambit involved hurling a red-hot iron bolt at Thor, with sufficient force to penetrate divine flesh, but the Thunder God caught the projectile with Gridr's iron gloves and returned it with interest, driving it through both Geirrodr and the stone pillar behind which he had taken shelter. This decisive action eliminated one of the most dangerous giants in Jotunheim and demonstrated Thor's ability to succeed even when deprived of his most powerful weapons. These major battles represented only the most famous examples of Thor's countless encounters with giant kind throughout his career as defender of the cosmos. His campaigns took him to every corner of the Nine Worlds, from the ice-covered peaks of Jotunheim to the underwater caverns where sea giants plotted against shipping lanes, from the volcanic forges where fire giants crafted weapons of mass destruction to the windswept plateaus where storm giants gathered the raw materials for weather magic that could devastate entire regions. Each encounter contributed to the ongoing balance between order and chaos that maintained cosmic stability, while also serving as a warning to other giants who might consider challenging divine authority. Thor's reputation as an implacable enemy of giant kind grew with each victory, creating a deterrent effect that prevented many potential conflicts from developing into actual threats. The knowledge that the Thunder God would respond to any serious challenge with overwhelming force encouraged most giants to pursue their goals through indirect means that avoided direct confrontation with Asgard's champion. The expedition to Utgard began under circumstances that revealed the complex dynamics between divine curiosity, mortal obligation, and the perpetual tension that existed between the ordered realm of Asgard and the chaotic territories beyond its protective boundaries. Thor's decision to undertake this journey emerged from a combination of restless energy that periodically seized him during peaceful periods and reports from mortal settlements about strange occurrences in the eastern lands that suggested giant activity requiring investigation. The Thunder God's protective instincts, always alert to potential threats against human communities, made such reports impossible to ignore despite the apparent remoteness of the danger. The composition of Thor's travelling party reflected both practical considerations and the complex web of relationships that bound the gods together in their shared responsibilities. Loki's inclusion in the expedition surprised no one familiar with their long history of joint adventures, despite the growing tensions that had begun to characterize their relationship. The shapeshifter's cunning and knowledge of giant territories made him an invaluable companion for ventures into hostile territory, while his ability to assume different forms provided tactical advantages that could prove crucial when facing unknown enemies. His presence also served to channel his restless nature into productive activity, rather than allowing it to manifest in the type of mischief that had recently caused problems within Asgard itself. The addition of two mortal servants, the Alfie and Roskva, transformed the expedition from a simple reconnaissance mission into a more complex undertaking that carried implications for the relationship between gods and mortals. These siblings had entered Thor's service under circumstances that demonstrated both the Thunder God's sense of justice and his understanding of the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the human communities. During a previous journey through Midgard, Thor had accepted hospitality from their family when darkness and weather made continued travel inadvisable. The evening meal that the family provided revealed their poverty despite their generous intentions, as they offered their guests the best food available in their modest household. Thor, recognizing both their sincere hospitality and their genuine need, had slaughtered his own goats, Tangrisnir and Tangnjosta, to provide a feast worthy of the occasion. These magical animals, capable of being killed and consumed one day, only to return to life the next morning, when Thor consecrated their bones with Mjolnir, represented one of the thunder god's most practical divine assets for extended travel. However, the resurrection process required that all bones remain intact and unbroken, a requirement that Thor had carefully explained to his hosts before the meal began. Young Thjalfi, overcome by curiosity and the incredible richness of the marrow within the goat's thigh bone, had cracked it open with his knife to extract the nutritious contents. When morning came and Thor prepared to restore his animals to life, one goat arose with a pronounced limp that immediately revealed the violation of his instructions. The thunder god's initial reaction had been one of towering rage that shook the very foundations of the family's humble dwelling. His eyes blazed with the fire of lightning, his grip on Mjolnir turned his knuckles white with strain, and his voice carried the rumble of approaching storms as he demanded an explanation for the injury to his sacred animal. The terror that seized the mortal family was absolute and genuine, as they recognized that they faced a divine wrath that could obliterate them and their entire community without effort. Yet Thor's anger, though genuine and overwhelming, was tempered by his understanding of mortal nature and his recognition that the boy's action had stemmed from curiosity rather than malicious intent. His sense of justice required compensation for the harm done to his property, but his protective nature toward human communities prevented him from exacting the type of punishment that would destroy an entire family for one member's mistake. The solution he proposed reflected his practical approach to problem solving and his understanding of how to transform a negative situation into one that served broader purposes. Thjalfi and Roskva would enter his service as compensation for their family's transgression, but this servitude would take the form of honoured companionship rather than degrading bondage. They would accompany him on his travels, assist in his various undertakings, and receive in return protection, education, and exposure to wonders that no other mortals would ever experience. Their presence in his household would also serve as a permanent reminder of the importance of maintaining proper relationships with human communities and the care required when divine power intersected with mortal lives. Thjalfi's exceptional speed had been evident even during his youth in his family's rural community, where his ability to outrun horses and cover vast distances without apparent fatigue had marked him as possessing supernatural gifts that transcended normal human limitations. This speed proved not merely useful but essential during Thor's various adventures, as the young man could serve as a messenger capable of covering distances that would require days for normal travellers to traverse. His endurance matched his velocity, allowing him to maintain his incredible pace over extended periods without the rest that ordinary mortals required. Roskva's contributions to Thor's household proved equally valuable, though less immediately obvious than her brother's spectacular speed. Her intelligence manifested in practical wisdom that complemented the god's more abstract knowledge, providing insights into mortal concerns and perspectives that divine beings sometimes overlooked. Her skills in domestic management ensured that their travelling party remained well supplied and organised regardless of the challenges posed by their various destinations. Her presence also provided a stabilising influence that helped moderate the sometimes volatile dynamics between Thor and Loki during their extended journeys. The route that Thor chose for their approach to Utgard led them through territories that revealed the gradual transition from the ordered lands under divine protection to the wild regions where giant influence held sway. The first day's travel took them through familiar countryside, where human settlements dotted the landscape, and well-maintained roads connected communities engaged in peaceful trade and agriculture. The presence of temples dedicated to various gods, the orderly arrangement of fields and pastures, and the general atmosphere of security and prosperity all testified to the effectiveness of divine protection in maintaining civilized life. As they progressed eastward, however, the signs of human habitation became increasingly sparse, and the landscape itself took on characteristics that reflected the proximity of chaotic forces. The roads deteriorated from well-paved thoroughfares to rough tracks barely suitable for cart traffic, then to mere footpaths that showed little evidence of regular maintenance. The few settlements they encountered were heavily fortified and displayed the wariness of communities that lived under constant threat from hostile forces. The forest through which their path led grew darker and more forbidding with each mile, their trees twisted into shapes that suggested malevolent intelligence rather than natural growth patterns. Strange sounds echoed from the depths of these woodlands, calls that resembled no known animals and seemed to carry meanings that bypassed rational understanding to create instinctive unease in all who heard them. The very air seemed thicker and more oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself resisted the presence of beings aligned with divine order. By the time darkness forced them to seek shelter for their first night away from civilized lands, they had entered territory where the normal rules governing divine and mortal existence operated according to principles that served chaotic rather than ordered purposes. The clearing where they established their camp showed signs of previous occupation by travellers who had not been entirely human, with fire rings built from stones that held heat far longer than natural rock, and the remnants of meals that included bones from creatures that existed nowhere in the normal world. The encounter with Skrymir began before any of the travellers realised they were no longer alone in the wilderness. The giant's approach was so subtle and gradual that even Loki's supernatural senses failed to detect his presence until he chose to reveal himself. This stealth capability in a being of such enormous size should have been impossible according to the normal laws governing physical existence. But the territories beyond divine protection operated according to different principles that allowed for phenomena that would be impossible elsewhere. When Skrymir finally made his presence known, the sheer scale of his physical form challenged the travellers' ability to comprehend what they were seeing. The giant stood so tall that his head disappeared into the low-hanging clouds that had gathered during the evening, while his shoulders spanned a width that could have accommodated several normal-sized buildings. His clothing appeared to be crafted from materials that existed nowhere else in the 9 worlds. Leather that retained the living essence of the creatures from which it had been taken, fur that continued to grow and shift as if still attached to living animals, and metal ornaments that seemed to contain trapped lightning that flickered and sparked with each of his movements. The giant's voice, when he spoke, carried undertones that resonated not only through the air, but through the ground itself, causing small avalanches in nearby hills and disturbing wildlife for miles in every direction. His words were courteous and seemingly friendly, offering to share his own campsite and provisions with the travellers, but the underlying power in his speech served as a constant reminder of the vast disparity in physical capabilities between himself and his guests. His casual mention of his own name and destination revealed his familiarity with their mission, and suggested that their expedition had been anticipated by forces in Utgard. The giant's proposal that they combine their camps for mutual benefit and protection appeared reasonable on the surface, particularly given the hostile nature of the territory through which they were travelling. His own fire blazed with flames that rose higher than the tallest trees and generated heat that could be felt from hundreds of yards away, while his supplies included provisions that would have fed a small army for weeks. The practical advantages of accepting his hospitality seemed obvious, even as the underlying dynamics of the situation created tensions that none of the travellers could entirely ignore. Thor's response to this encounter revealed both his straightforward nature and his understanding of the complex etiquette governing interactions between divine and giant representatives in neutral territory. His acceptance of Skrymir's offer was courteous but cautious, acknowledging the giant's generosity while maintaining the dignity appropriate to his own status as a representative of Asgard. The Thunder God's hand remained near Mjolnir throughout their initial conversation, not in open threat, but as a reminder of his own capabilities should the situation deteriorate into conflict. The evening meal that Skrymir provided exceeded anything the travellers had expected to encounter in the wilderness, featuring foods that combined familiar ingredients with preparations that suggested culinary traditions developed over centuries of giant civilization. The portions were scaled to accommodate the host's enormous appetite, but even the smallest servings provided more nourishment than the travellers could consume. The giant's casual consumption of quantities that would have fed entire human communities for days served as another demonstration of the fundamental differences between their respective natures. Throughout the meal, Skrymir's conversation revealed extensive knowledge of current events in both Asgard and the mortal realms, suggesting intelligence networks that operated far beyond what the gods had previously suspected. His questions about their mission were phrased as casual curiosity rather than interrogation, but their precision and focus indicated that he already possessed significant information about their purposes and destinations. This knowledge created an atmosphere of subtle menace beneath the surface courtesy of their interactions. When the time came to settle for the night, Skrymir's preparations for sleep demonstrated capabilities that challenged normal understanding of how physical existence operated in the wilderness. His snoring, once he'd fallen asleep, generated sounds that resembled continuous thunder punctuated by the crash of falling trees and the rumble of distant avalanches. The ground shook with each breath, making restful sleep impossible for his companions despite their exhaustion from the day's travel. Thor's growing frustration with their host's unconscious assault on their rest led him to attempt direct intervention in the giant's sleep patterns. His first approach involved a gentle strike to Skrymir's head with Mjolnir, delivered with just enough force to wake a normal sleeper without causing serious injury. The hammer's impact, which should have been sufficient to level a mountain, produced only a slight stirring from the giant, who brushed at his forehead as if bothered by a falling leaf before resuming his thunderous snoring. The Thunder God's second attempt employed significantly more force, as his patience with the situation had worn thin and his need for rest had become genuinely urgent. This blow, delivered with enough power to shatter boulders, again produced only minimal response from their host. Skrymir mumbled something about acorns falling from trees before settling back into sleep patterns that continued to make rest impossible for his companions. Thor's final attempt to resolve the situation involved the application of his full strength, channeling the power that had levelled mountains and defeated the mightiest giants in direct combat. The impact of Mjolnir, driven with every ounce of force that the Thunder God could generate, created a crater in the ground beside Skrymir's head and sent shockwaves through the surrounding landscape that toppled trees and triggered rock slides in nearby hills. Yet the giant's only response was to comment sleepily about the possibility of birds dropping twigs from their nests overhead. This demonstration of Skrymir's apparent invulnerability to even Thor's mightiest efforts created profound unease among the travellers, challenging their understanding of the nature of giant capabilities and the effectiveness of divine power in territories beyond normal cosmic boundaries. The implications of facing opponents who could ignore attacks that had previously proven decisive against the most formidable enemies suggested that their mission might encounter obstacles that exceeded their ability to overcome through conventional means. The morning's revelations provided partial explanation for the previous night's frustrations, while introducing new complications that would shape the remainder of their journey. Skrymir's casual mention of his true identity as merely a servant or minor representative of the powers they would encounter in Utgard served as a warning about the scale of the challenges that awaited them. His advice about proper behaviour during their visit carried undertones that suggested consequences for inappropriate conduct that would exceed mere diplomatic embarrassment. The giant's departure, accomplished with the same supernatural stealth that had characterised his initial approach, left the travellers alone in a landscape that seemed somehow more hostile and forbidding than it had appeared during his presence. The realization that they had been under observation and evaluation throughout their encounter created new awareness of the sophisticated intelligence that governed giant activities in these remote territories. Their mission had clearly been anticipated, and preparations had been made to test their capabilities and resolve before they reached their ultimate destination. The The approach to Utgard itself revealed the true scale of giant civilization and the extent to which their society had developed along lines that paralleled but diverged from the structures that governed divine and mortal communities. The fortress that served as the Giant King's stronghold rose from the landscape like a mountain range, crafted by intelligent design, its walls reaching heights that disappeared into the clouds, while its foundations extended deep into the Earth's core. The architectural principles governing its construction combined massive scale with sophisticated engineering that demonstrated capabilities far exceeding what divine observers had previously attributed to giant society. The gates that provided access to this stronghold were scaled to accommodate beings of enormous size, while incorporating defensive features that would challenge any conceivable assault. Their massive hinges were crafted from metals that existed nowhere else in the Nine Worlds, while the locking mechanisms involved principles of engineering that suggested technological development along paths completely different from those pursued by gods or mortals. The guards who manned these entrances displayed the casual competence of professional soldiers whose experience encompassed threats that would challenge the most formidable divine champions. The interior spaces of Utgard revealed a civilization that had achieved levels of sophistication and complexity that rivaled anything found in Asgard itself. The great halls where the giant king held court could have accommodated entire mortal cities within their boundaries, while their architectural details demonstrated artistic sensibilities that combined massive scale with refined aesthetic judgment. The furnishings and decorations reflected cultural traditions that had developed over millennia of independent giant civilization, creating an environment that was both magnificent and subtly alien to divine sensibilities. Utgard-Loki's reception of his visitors demonstrated the complex etiquette governing interactions between representatives of different cosmic powers within neutral territory. His courtesy was impeccable by any standard, acknowledging their status and treating them with the respect due to honoured guests, while simultaneously making clear his own authority within his domain and his awareness of their true purposes. The Giant King's physical presence commanded attention through sheer scale and the aura of power that surrounded him, but his intellectual capabilities proved equally impressive as revealed through his sophisticated understanding of divine politics and cosmic dynamics. The challenges that Utgard-Loki proposed to his guests were presented as friendly competitions designed to demonstrate the relative capabilities of different cosmic powers, but their underlying purpose involved testing fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the limits of divine authority. Each contest was carefully designed to probe specific aspects of the visitor's abilities while revealing truths about the cosmos that challenged conventional understanding of how power operated in different realms and circumstances. Thor's attempt to drain the drinking horn presented to him appeared straightforward on the surface, a simple test of capacity and endurance that should have favoured his divine constitution and legendary appetite. The horn itself, while large by normal standards, seemed well within the Thunder God's ability to empty through sustained effort. His initial attempts to drain its contents proceeded normally, with the liquid level dropping at a pace that suggested eventual success despite the challenge's difficulty. However, as Thor continued his efforts, the horn's contents seemed to replenish themselves through some mechanism that defied normal understanding of how containers and liquids operated. Each mighty draught that he consumed appeared to have minimal impact on the overall volume remaining, while his own capacity for continued consumption began to reach limits that he had never before encountered. The growing realization that he was failing at a task that should have been well within his capabilities created frustration that intensified with each unsuccessful attempt. The giant spectators' reactions to Thor's struggles combined genuine amazement at his capacity with subtle amusement at his apparent inability to complete what they had presented as a simple challenge. Their comments and observations, while maintaining the courtesy appropriate to the situation, carried undertones that suggested they had anticipated his difficulties and were using his performance to evaluate capabilities that extended beyond mere physical prowess. The psychological pressure created by this audience added another dimension to the challenge that transformed it from a simple test of endurance into a complex evaluation of character and determination. When Thor finally acknowledged his inability to empty the horn completely, his failure represented more than simple defeat in a drinking contest. The experience had challenged his understanding of his own capabilities and introduced doubt about the effectiveness of divine power when confronted with phenomena that operated according to unfamiliar principles. This doubt would prove crucial in shaping his approach to the subsequent challenges and his interpretation of their outcomes. The lifting contest that followed presented Thor with an opponent that appeared even more manageable than the drinking horn, a grey cat of ordinary size that wandered freely through Utgard-Loki's Great Hall. The Giant King's suggestion that Thor demonstrate his legendary strength by lifting this seemingly insignificant animal appeared almost insulting in its simplicity, particularly following his frustrating experience with the horn. The Thunder God's initial confidence in his ability to complete this task easily reflected his reasonable expectation that divine strength should easily overcome such a trivial challenge. Thor's first attempts to lift the cat proceeded according to his expectations, with the animal rising easily from the ground as he applied gradually increasing force. However, as he attempted to raise it higher, the cat's apparent weight began to increase in ways that defied normal understanding of how physical objects behaved under applied force. What had begun as a simple lifting exercise transformed into a struggle against resistance that seemed to grow exponentially with each inch of elevation he achieved. The cat itself remained passive throughout this contest, showing no signs of distress or resistance to Thor's efforts, yet somehow becoming increasingly difficult to lift as the challenge progressed. Its grey fur seemed to shimmer with patterns that suggested depth and complexity beyond normal feline characteristics, while its eyes reflected intelligence that transcended ordinary animal awareness. The growing realization that this was no ordinary cat added psychological complexity to what had begun as a simple physical challenge. Thor's maximum effort, channeling all his divine strength enhanced by Megingjord's power amplification, succeeded only in lifting one of the cat's paws from the ground before the resistance became too great to overcome. This minimal achievement, accomplished through the application of force that had previously moved mountains and defeated the mightiest giants, represented a failure that challenged everything Thor understood about the nature of strength and the limits of divine power. The giant spectator's respectful acknowledgement of his achievement, treating the lifting of a single paw as a noteworthy accomplishment, added another layer of confusion to his understanding of what had just occurred. The wrestling match that concluded Thor's trials presented him with an opponent whose appearance seemed to mock the very concept of physical combat. The elderly woman whom Utgard-Loki summoned to face the Thunder God in wrestling appeared so frail and decrepit that the contest seemed less like a fair challenge than a cruel joke designed to humiliate divine pretensions. Her bent back, trembling limbs, and obvious physical weakness created a situation where victory would bring no honour while defeat would represent the ultimate humiliation. Yet Thor's sense of honour and his commitment to facing any challenge prevented him from refusing the contest, despite its apparent absurdity. His initial approach to the wrestling match involved careful restraint, as he sought to demonstrate his superior strength without causing injury to an opponent who seemed incapable of offering meaningful resistance. This restraint, however, proved unnecessary as the old woman's apparent frailty masked capabilities that defied normal understanding of how age and physical deterioration affected combat effectiveness. The wrestling match that followed challenged every assumption Thor held about the relationship between appearance and capability, between age and strength, between divine power and the fundamental forces that governed existence. The old woman's techniques seemed to draw upon principles that transcended normal wrestling skills, employing leverage and timing that neutralized Thor's overwhelming physical advantages while gradually forcing him into increasingly disadvantageous positions. As the contest progressed, Thor found himself exerting greater and greater effort to maintain his footing against an opponent whose frail appearance had given no indication of her true capabilities. His divine strength, enhanced by his magical belt and channeled through techniques perfected over centuries of combat experience, proved insufficient to gain decisive advantage against wrestling skills that seemed to operate according to principles he could not comprehend or counter effectively. The match's conclusion, with Thor forced to one knee by an opponent whose identity and nature remained mysterious, represented a defeat that transcended simple physical failure. The experience had demonstrated the existence of forces that could overcome even divine power when properly applied, while revealing the limitations of strength when confronted with opponents who operated according to unfamiliar principles. The respectful treatment he received from the giant spectators, who acknowledged his performance as creditable despite his obvious defeat, added complexity to his understanding of how his efforts had been evaluated. Thor's role as protector of Midgard extended far beyond his spectacular battles against giants and cosmic threats, encompassing a vast network of daily interventions, blessings, and protective activities that touched every aspect of mortal existence. The Thunder God's connection to human communities operated through multiple channels that reflected both his divine nature and his earthborn heritage from Jord, creating a relationship between deity and worshippers that was more intimate and practical than the abstract reverence accorded to many other gods. His frequent journeys throughout the mortal realm were not random wanderings, but systematic patrols designed to identify and address threats before they could develop into existential dangers for vulnerable human settlements. The geography of Thor's protective activities encompassed the entire known world, from the icebound fjords of the far north where hardy fishing communities battled both natural elements and supernatural predators, to the dense forests of the interior where farming settlements carved precarious clearings from wilderness that teemed with hostile creatures. His knowledge of Midgard's landscape was encyclopedic, accumulated through centuries of travel that had taken him to every corner of the mortal realm and familiarized him with the specific challenges faced by different types of human communities. Coastal villages required protection from sea monsters and giant-spawned storms. Mountain settlements faced threats from trolls and rock giants, while agricultural communities in fertile valleys attracted the attention of various supernatural entities drawn to the concentrated life force of growing crops and domesticated animals. The Thunder God's approach to protecting human communities reflected his practical nature and his understanding that effective defense required both reactive responses to immediate threats and proactive measures to prevent problems from developing. His regular circuits through Midgard followed patterns that maximized his ability to detect early signs of supernatural activity, while ensuring that no region remained unvisited for extended periods. These journeys were not ceremonial progresses, but working expeditions during which Thor actively investigated reports of strange occurrences, examined physical evidence of monster activity, and consulted with local leaders about emerging threats to their community's safety and prosperity. Thor's interactions with mortal leaders revealed his sophisticated understanding of human political structures and his recognition that effective protection required cooperation with existing authority figures rather than arbitrary divine intervention that might disrupt established social hierarchies. Village elders, tribal chieftains, and regional kings found in Thor a divine patron who respected their temporal authority while providing supernatural backing for their efforts to maintain order and security within their domains. His consultations with these leaders were genuine exchanges of information rather than one-sided divine pronouncements, as Thor recognized that local knowledge about specific threats and community vulnerabilities was essential for developing effective protective strategies. The blessing of marriages represented one of Thor's most significant contributions to mortal welfare, as these ceremonies not only united individual couples, but established the family units that form the foundation of human society. Thor's presence at wedding celebrations, whether physical or spiritual, consecrated the union between husband and wife while invoking divine protection for their future offspring and their household's prosperity. The hammer Mjolnir played a central role in these blessing rituals, as its placement upon the bride's lap during the ceremony transferred the thunder god's protective power to the new family unit and ensured that their children would be born under divine auspices. The agricultural dimensions of Thor's protective role connected directly to his control over weather patterns and his intimate understanding of the seasonal cycles that governed crop production. Farmers throughout Midgard timed their planting and harvesting activities according to signs that indicated Thor's approval or displeasure with their efforts, reading the patterns of storms and clear skies as divine communication about optimal agricultural practices. The thunder god's blessing of newly planted fields involved more than ceremonial gestures, as his power could influence soil fertility, moisture levels, and the electrical charges in the atmosphere that promoted healthy plant growth. Thor's involvement in crop blessing ceremonies demonstrated his detailed knowledge of agricultural science and his ability to apply divine power in ways that supported, rather than disrupted, natural growing processes. His hammer's consecration of freshly ploughed fields charged the soil with beneficial energies that enhanced germination rates and promoted robust plant development, while his control over rainfall patterns ensured that crops received optimal moisture at crucial stages of their growth cycles. The timing of these interventions required precise understanding of both meteorological conditions and plant biology, as inappropriate weather at the wrong moments could destroy entire harvests despite the best divine intentions. The fertility aspects of Thor's protective role extended beyond agricultural concerns to encompass human reproduction and the continuation of family lines that maintained community stability across generations. Couples experiencing difficulty conceiving children sought Thor's intervention through specific rituals that invoked his power over life-giving forces and his connection to the Earth's generative capabilities. These fertility blessings often involved elaborate ceremonies that combined elements of weather magic with agricultural symbolism, reflecting the interconnected nature of human reproduction, crop fertility, and the seasonal cycles that governed both processes. Thor's defense of human communities against trolls represented one of his most frequent and challenging responsibilities, as these creatures combined supernatural strength with cunning intelligence that made them formidable opponents even for divine champions. Trolls inhabited the marginal territories between civilized lands and true wilderness, establishing lairs in caves, abandoned ruins, and dense forest groves from which they launched raids against human settlements during times when divine attention was focused elsewhere. Their nocturnal habits and vulnerability to sunlight created tactical complications that required Thor to adapt his usual direct approach to accommodate the specific weaknesses and capabilities of these particular enemies. The Thunder God's anti-troll campaigns involved extensive reconnaissance to locate hidden lairs and identify the specific individuals responsible for attacks on human communities. Trolls were not mindless monsters, but intelligent beings with their own social structures, territorial disputes, and complex motivations that influenced their interactions with human settlements. Some trolls raided for food and treasure, others sought to expand their territorial control, while certain individuals harboured specific grudges against particular communities based on historical conflicts or perceived slights that had occurred generations earlier. Thor's strategies for dealing with troll threats varied according to the specific circumstances of each situation and the nature of the creatures involved. Solitary trolls who had established lairs near human settlements could often be eliminated through direct confrontation, as Thor's speed and power allowed him to locate and destroy individual threats before they could escape to their underground refuges. However, Troll communities that had organised themselves into larger groups required more sophisticated approaches that took into account their collective defensive capabilities and their ability to coordinate resistance against divine intervention. The most challenging troll encounters involved creatures that had formed alliances with giants or other supernatural entities, creating combined threats that exceeded the capabilities of individual monsters. These alliances often developed around shared antipathy toward human expansion into territories that the supernatural creatures considered their ancestral domains, leading to coordinated campaigns against frontier settlements that required Thor's full attention and maximum application of his divine powers. The defeat of such alliances typically involved not only the destruction of the immediate threats, but also diplomatic efforts to prevent similar coalitions from forming in the future. Giant-spawned threats to human communities took many forms beyond direct military assault, including the corruption of natural resources, the manipulation of weather patterns to destroy crops, and the introduction of supernatural diseases that could devastate entire populations. Thor's responses to these indirect attacks required different skills than those needed for conventional combat, as he had to identify the sources of subtle magical interference while developing countermeasures that addressed root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. His investigations into giant-sponsored attacks on human communities often led him deep into hostile territory where conventional divine powers might prove insufficient against enemies operating on their home ground. The ritual practices surrounding Thor worship among Norse communities reflected the practical nature of his relationship with mortal followers and their understanding of how to maintain favourable connections with their divine protector. Unlike the abstract theological concepts associated with some deities, Thor worship involved concrete actions and offerings that demonstrated the worshipper's commitment to upholding the values and behaviours that the thunder god endorsed. These rituals were not mere ceremonial observances, but active partnerships between divine and mortal participants working towards shared goals of community protection and prosperity. Hammer amulets worn by Thor's followers served multiple functions that extended beyond simple religious identification to include practical magical applications that provided real protection against supernatural threats. These miniature representations of Mjolnir were crafted according to specific patterns and consecrated through rituals that connected them directly to the thunder god's power, creating a network of divine influence that extended his protective presence throughout Midgard, even when his physical attention was focused elsewhere. The metalworking techniques used to create these amulets incorporated both practical craftsmanship and magical procedures that imbued the finished products with genuine supernatural properties. The materials used for hammer amulets varied according to the resources available to different communities and the specific types of protection sought by individual wearers. Iron amulets provided general protection against hostile magic and supernatural creatures, while silver versions offered enhanced defensive capabilities against specific types of threats such as trolls and evil spirits. The most powerful amulets incorporated metals that had been struck by lightning or forged during thunderstorms, as these materials retained traces of Thor's direct influence that amplified their protective effects. Sacred groves dedicated to Thor worship served as focal points for community religious activities and as gathering places where his followers could perform the group rituals necessary for major blessings and protective ceremonies. These natural temples were typically established in locations that showed evidence of Thor's presence, such as clearings where lightning had struck repeatedly, or hilltops that attracted unusual storm activity. The trees within these groves were considered sacred and were protected by strict taboos that prevented their use for mundane purposes while ensuring their availability for religious ceremonies. The maintenance of Thor's sacred groves required ongoing community effort that demonstrated the worshippers' commitment to their divine patron while providing practical benefits that reinforced the value of religious observance. Regular cleaning and maintenance of these sites created gathering opportunities that strengthened social bonds within communities while ensuring that the groves remained suitable for ceremonial use. The seasonal festivals held in these locations combined religious observance with community celebration, creating positive associations that encouraged continued participation in Thor worship. Thor's intervention in specific threats to human communities often began with subtle signs that trained observers could recognize as indicators of supernatural danger requiring divine attention. Unusual animal behavior, unexplained crop failures, and strange weather patterns all served as early warning systems that alerted both Thor and his mortal followers to developing problems that might require intervention before they escalated into existential threats. The Thunder God's ability to detect these early indicators reflected both his intimate knowledge of natural patterns and his supernatural senses that could perceive disturbances in the cosmic order that preceded overt manifestations of hostile activity. The defensive measures that Thor implemented to protect vulnerable communities involved both immediate responses to active threats and long-term strategies designed to reduce the likelihood of future attacks. His physical destruction of monster lairs eliminated immediate dangers while also serving as warnings to other potential threats about the consequences of attacking human settlements. However, the most effective protection came from the establishment of divine presence markers that created permanent deterrent effects in areas where Thor had intervened directly. These presence markers took various forms depending on the specific circumstances of each intervention and the types of threats that had been addressed. Lightning-struck trees marked locations where Thor had destroyed particularly dangerous enemies, serving as permanent reminders of divine protection, while also providing focal points for local worship activities. Stone formations created by Mjolnir's impact became sacred sites where communities could perform rituals that reinforced their connection to Thor's protective power. The electromagnetic effects of these divine interventions often persisted for decades, creating zones where hostile supernatural creatures experienced discomfort or weakness that discouraged them from approaching protected settlements. The theft of Mjolnir began on what appeared to be an ordinary morning in Asgard, when Thor awoke from deep slumber to reach for his legendary hammer and found nothing but empty space where the weapon should have rested. The Thunder God's initial confusion quickly transformed into mounting alarm as he searched his dwelling thoroughly, examining every corner and crevice where the hammer might have been misplaced during the previous evening's activities. His growing panic was not merely the result of losing a valuable possession, but stemmed from the profound implications of Mjolnir's absence for the security of all 9 worlds. The hammer's disappearance represented far more than simple theft. It constituted a fundamental disruption of the cosmic order that Thor was sworn to protect. Without Mjolnir, the Thunder God found himself stripped of the primary tool that defined his role as defender of Asgard and champion against the forces of chaos. The weapon's absence left him capable of tremendous physical feats through his natural strength and divine artifacts, but unable to generate the lightning strikes and thunder that served as both weapons and symbols of his authority over storm and sky. Thor's frantic search of his quarters revealed no signs of forced entry or struggle, suggesting that whoever had taken Mjolnir possessed either supernatural stealth capabilities or intimate knowledge of Asgard's defences that allowed them to penetrate the heart of the divine stronghold undetected. The implications of such a security breach extended far beyond the immediate crisis, raising questions about the vulnerability of other divine artifacts and the effectiveness of the protective measures that supposedly safeguarded the god's most precious possessions. The Thunder God's distress attracted the attention of other Aesir, who gathered to witness the unprecedented spectacle of their mightiest champion, reduced to helpless frustration by the loss of his defining weapon. Their initial attempts to assist in the search proved fruitless. A systematic examination of Thor's dwelling and the surrounding areas yielded no clues about the hammer's whereabouts or the identity of the thief responsible for its disappearance. The growing realization that Mjolnir had truly vanished created an atmosphere of unease throughout Asgard, that reflected the gods' understanding of their increased vulnerability. Loki's arrival at the scene of this divine crisis brought with him the analytical skills and knowledge of supernatural capabilities that made him uniquely qualified to investigate thefts involving magical artifacts. The shapeshifter's examination of the evidence revealed subtle traces of giant magic that had been carefully concealed but remained detectable to someone with his expertise in deceptive practices and supernatural concealment techniques. His identification of these magical signatures provided the first concrete lead in determining who might have been responsible for the theft and how they had accomplished such an audacious crime. The trickster's investigation led him to suspect giant involvement, but the sophistication of the theft suggested coordination and planning that exceeded the capabilities of typical giant raiders. The complete absence of physical evidence, the precise timing that had allowed the thieves to act while Thor slept deeply, and the magical concealment that had hidden their activities, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated operation that required both supernatural abilities and detailed intelligence about Asgard's internal security arrangements. Loki's decision to pursue the investigation beyond Asgard's borders reflected both his genuine concern for the crisis and his recognition that his unique abilities made him the most qualified divine agent for this type of covert mission. His shape-shifting capabilities would allow him to infiltrate giant territories without detection, while his knowledge of deceptive practices would help him recognize and counter the concealment techniques that had been used to hide Mjolnir's location. The urgency of the situation demanded immediate action, as each day that passed with the hammer in hostile hands increased the likelihood that it would be used against its rightful owner and his divine allies. The journey to Jotunheim required Loki to employ his most sophisticated disguise techniques, as giant territories were actively hostile to divine visitors and maintained constant vigilance against Aesir infiltration attempts. His transformation into bird form provided both the mobility necessary to cover vast distances quickly and the anonymity that would allow him to observe giant activities without arousing suspicion. The flight across the boundary between Asgard and the giant realm revealed landscape changes that reflected the fundamental differences between ordered divine territory and the chaotic regions where giant influence held sway. Jotunheim's geography presented a harsh contrast to Asgard's carefully maintained beauty, featuring rocky wastes, twisted forests, and mountain ranges that seemed to have been shaped by malevolent intelligence rather than natural geological processes. The giant settlements scattered throughout this forbidding landscape displayed architectural styles that emphasized defensive capabilities over aesthetic considerations, with massive walls and fortified compounds that could withstand siege warfare while providing bases for raids against neighbouring territories. Loki's aerial reconnaissance of giant territories eventually led him to the stronghold of Thrymr, the giant king whose domain encompassed some of the most strategically important regions of Jotunheim and whose political influence extended throughout giant society. The fortress itself represented one of the most impressive examples of giant architecture, with walls that rose from living rock and towers that commanded views across multiple valleys and mountain passes. The defensive arrangements surrounding Thrymr's stronghold indicated both his awareness of potential threats and his confidence in his ability to repel any conventional assault. The discovery of Mjolnir's location came through careful observation of the Giant King's activities, rather than direct investigation of his treasure vaults. Loki's patient surveillance revealed Thrymr engaged in conversations with his advisors that referenced recent acquisitions and upcoming negotiations that clearly involved the stolen hammer. The giant's casual mentions of his new leverage over the gods and his plans for exploiting this advantage provided confirmation that he was indeed responsible for the theft, while also revealing the scope of his ambitions for the weapon's use. Thrymr's demands for the hammer's return, when Loki finally approached him in diplomatic disguise, exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations about giant greed and ambition. The Giant King's price for returning Mjolnir was nothing less than marriage to Freya, the most beautiful of the goddesses and one of the most powerful practitioners of cedar magic in all the 9 worlds. This demand revealed both Thrymr's understanding of the hammer's strategic importance and his recognition that such an audacious theft required equally audacious compensation to make the risk worthwhile. The giant's insistence on marriage to Freya rather than more conventional forms of payment reflected his sophisticated understanding of divine politics and his recognition that such a union would fundamentally alter the balance of power between gods and giants. Freya's magical abilities, combined with her political connections and her role in various divine ceremonies, made her one of the most valuable potential hostages that giant society could possibly acquire. Her presence in Jotunheim would provide Thrymr with ongoing leverage over divine decision-making, while also giving him access to magical knowledge that could enhance giant capabilities in future conflicts. The Giant King's confidence in his negotiating position stemmed from his accurate assessment of the god's dependence on Thor's hammer for maintaining cosmic security. Without Mjolnir, the Thunder God's ability to respond to giant threats was severely compromised, while other divine champions lacked the specific capabilities necessary to fill the gap left by the weapon's absence. Thrymr's timing of the theft had been carefully calculated to coincide with a period when other threats to cosmic stability were minimal, ensuring that the gods would feel maximum pressure to meet his demands rather than attempting alternative solutions. Loki's return to Asgard with news of Thrymr's demands created consternation among the assembled gods that reflected both their outrage at the giant's audacity and their recognition of the difficult position in which they found themselves. The prospect of surrendering Freya to secure Mjolnir's return was unthinkable for multiple reasons, not least of which was the goddess's own fierce independence and her certain refusal to sacrifice herself for the sake of retrieving even the most important divine artifact. Freya's reaction to learning of Thrymr's demands confirmed the god's expectations about her willingness to cooperate with such a scheme. Her fury at the suggestion that she might be traded like a piece of property created atmospheric disturbances throughout Asgard that rivaled Thor's own displays of divine anger, while her explicit refusal to consider the proposal eliminated any possibility that the crisis might be resolved through straightforward negotiation with the Giant King. The goddess's rejection of Thrymr's terms forced the assembled gods to consider alternative approaches to recovering Mjolnir that would avoid the unacceptable cost of surrendering one of their own to giant control. The brainstorming session that followed revealed the limitations of conventional divine capabilities when confronted with opponents who possessed both supernatural cunning and detailed knowledge of Aesir weaknesses. Direct military assault on Thrymr's stronghold was impossible without Thor's hammer, while diplomatic solutions had been foreclosed by the giant's unreasonable demands and Freya's understandable refusal to cooperate. Loki's proposal for resolving the crisis emerged from his unique perspective as both a divine insider and someone whose own nature incorporated elements of the chaotic thinking that characterized giant approaches to problem-solving. His suggestion that Thor disguise himself as Freya to infiltrate Thrymr's wedding feast represented a solution that combined deception, role reversal, and calculated risk-taking in ways that exemplified the trickster's approach to seemingly impossible challenges. The plan's audacity was matched by its practical complexity, as successfully disguising the most masculine of the gods as the most beautiful goddess would require not only physical transformation, but also behavioral modifications that challenge Thor's fundamental nature. The Thunder God's initial resistance to the proposal reflected both his personal dignity and his concern about the potential consequences of discovery during such a vulnerable infiltration mission. His eventual acceptance of the plan demonstrated his recognition that unconventional problems sometimes required unconventional solutions, even when those solutions involved significant personal sacrifice and risk. The transformation of Thor into a convincing Freya required the combined efforts of multiple gods working with magical techniques that pushed the boundaries of their shape-changing abilities. The physical alterations alone presented enormous challenges, as Thor's massive frame, distinctive red hair, and unmistakably masculine features needed to be modified to match Freya's renowned beauty and feminine grace. The magical procedures involved in this transformation required careful coordination to ensure that the disguise would withstand close examination while maintaining enough flexibility to allow Thor to function effectively during the infiltration mission. The selection of appropriate clothing and jewellery for Thor's disguise involved detailed attention to the specific items that were associated with Freya's public appearances and ceremonial functions. The goddess's distinctive necklace, Brisingamen, was considered essential for creating a convincing impersonation, while her characteristic dress and accessories required careful replication to avoid arousing suspicion among giant observers who might be familiar with her appearance from previous diplomatic encounters. Loki's role as Thor's companion during the infiltration mission reflected both his expertise in deceptive practices and his ability to provide real-time support for maintaining the disguise under challenging circumstances. His own transformation into a serving woman would allow him to remain close to Thor throughout the wedding festivities while providing assistance with behavioural cues and social interactions that might reveal the deception if handled incorrectly. The journey to Thrymm's stronghold for the wedding ceremony required careful attention to maintaining the disguise while travelling through territories where giant scouts might observe and report on the approaching bridal party. The use of Thor's goat-drawn chariot provided both transportation appropriate to divine status and a means of demonstrating the supposed bride's power and importance to potential observers along the route. The wedding feast itself presented the ultimate test of the disguise's effectiveness, and Thor's ability to maintain feminine behaviour patterns under circumstances that challenged every aspect of his normal personality. The Giant King's elaborate preparations for the ceremony reflected both his excitement about acquiring such a prestigious bride and his desire to demonstrate his own wealth and power to the assembled giant nobility who had gathered to witness this unprecedented union between divine and giant royalty. Thor's performance during the feast required him to suppress his natural appetites and behavioural patterns while adopting mannerisms that would be consistent with Freya's known characteristics. His consumption of enormous quantities of food and drink, which would have been normal for his own wedding celebration, created suspicion among the giant guests that required quick thinking from Loki to explain through invented stories about the bride's nervous excitement and her long journey from Asgard. The trickster's explanations for Thor's unusual behaviour demonstrated his quick wit and his understanding of how to manipulate giant expectations to support their deceptive scheme. His claims about Freya's eagerness for the marriage and her excitement about joining giant society provided plausible explanations for behavioural anomalies while also flattering Thrymm's ego and reinforcing his confidence in the success of his ambitious plan. The climactic moment of the deception came when Thrym, following traditional wedding customs, placed Mjolnir in the bride's lap to consecrate the marriage and ensure the couple's fertility. This ceremonial gesture, intended to demonstrate the Giant King's generosity and his confidence in his new bride's loyalty, instead provided Thor with the opportunity he'd been waiting for throughout the elaborate charade. The Thunder God's transformation back to his true form occurred with explosive suddenness that caught the assembled giants completely unprepared for the reversal of their apparent triumph. His first actions upon reclaiming Mjolnir involved systematic elimination of the giant nobility who had gathered to witness his supposed humiliation, ensuring that news of the successful deception would not spread throughout Jotunheim to inspire similar attempts at manipulating divine vulnerabilities. The massacre that followed Thor's revelation demonstrated both his pent-up frustration at the humiliating disguise and his determination to send a clear message about the consequences of attempting to steal divine artifacts. His methodical destruction of Thrymm's wedding guests served multiple purposes, eliminating potential future threats, while also providing an outlet for the anger and embarrassment that had accumulated during his performance as a reluctant bride. The cosmic enmity between Thor and Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, represented one of the most fundamental antagonisms in Norse mythology, embodying the eternal struggle between protective order and destructive chaos that would ultimately culminate in their mutual destruction during Ragnarok. This serpentine monster, offspring of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, had grown to such immense proportions that it encircled the entire world of Midgard, grasping its own tail in its mouth and lying hidden beneath the ocean's depths, where its massive coils created underwater mountain ranges and oceanic trenches that shaped the geography of the mortal realm. Jormungandr's origins traced back to the early days of cosmic order, when the gods, recognizing the prophetic warnings about Loki's monstrous children, attempted to contain the threats posed by these beings before they could mature into existential dangers. The serpent siblings, the wolf Fenrir and the death goddess Hel, had been dealt with through binding and exile respectively, but Jormungandra's nature as an aquatic creature presented unique challenges that required a different approach to containment. Odin's decision to cast the young serpent into the ocean surrounding Midgard was intended to isolate the creature in an environment where it could grow without immediate threat to divine or mortal populations, but this solution proved to be merely a temporary postponement of an inevitable confrontation. The serpent's growth in the ocean depths proceeded at a rate that exceeded even the gods' most pessimistic projections, fed by the vast abundance of sea life and the magical energies that permeated the waters surrounding the world tree Yggdrasil. Each passing year saw Jormungandra's length increase by hundreds of miles, its girth expanding to proportions that could crush mountains, while its venomous breath created toxic clouds that killed marine life across vast areas of the ocean. The creature's presence beneath the waves generated underwater currents and tidal patterns that affected weather systems throughout Midgard, creating storms and atmospheric disturbances that served as constant reminders of the monster's growing power. The serpent's position encircling Midgard was not merely a result of its enormous size, but reflected its deliberate adoption of a strategic stance that maximized its ability to threaten human civilization while remaining relatively protected from divine intervention. By maintaining its coils beneath the ocean's surface, Jormungandr avoided direct confrontation with Thor, while ensuring that any attempt to attack it would require the thunder god to venture into an aquatic environment where his usual advantages in mobility and leverage would be severely compromised. The serpent's tail-grasping posture created a living barrier around the mortal world that could be tightened at will to crush coastal settlements, or loosened to allow massive tidal waves to devastate inland areas. Thor's awareness of Jormungandra's presence and growing threat developed gradually through reports from mortal seafarers who encountered evidence of the serpent's activities during their voyages. Fishing vessels reported finding dead sea creatures floating in areas where the water had been poisoned by the monster's breath, while merchant ships described underwater disturbances that created whirlpools and rogue waves capable of destroying entire fleets. Coastal communities experienced unprecedented tidal variations that flooded agricultural lands and destroyed harbours, forcing the thunder god to recognize that his protective responsibilities extended to threats that remained largely hidden from direct observation. The cosmic significance of the enmity between Thor and Jormungandr extended beyond their personal antagonism to encompass fundamental principles that governed the Norse understanding of universal order. Thor represented the active force of divine protection, wielding his hammer to defend civilization against the chaotic elements that constantly pressed against the boundaries of the ordered world. Jormungandr embodied the primordial chaos that had existed before the gods imposed structure upon the cosmos, a force of entropy and destruction that sought to return the universe to the undifferentiated state that had preceded creation. Their conflict was prophetically ordained from the moment of the serpent's birth, as the Norns had woven into the threads of fate the certainty that these two cosmic forces would eventually meet in battle that would result in the destruction of both combatants. This prophetic dimension added layers of tragic inevitability to their encounters, as both Thor and Jormungandr were aware that their mutual enmity would ultimately prove fatal to each participant. The knowledge of this destined outcome influenced their interactions throughout the ages, creating a dynamic where each confrontation served as both a test of current capabilities and a rehearsal for the final battle that awaited them at the end of the world. The first major encounter between Thor and Jormungandr occurred during the Thunder God's fishing expedition with the giant Hymir, an adventure that began as a seemingly routine journey to obtain food for a divine feast, but escalated into one of the most dangerous confrontations in Norse mythology. Hymir's reputation as a skilled fisherman and his possession of the strongest fishing equipment available made him an ideal companion for an expedition designed to catch enough fish to feed the assembled gods. But the giant's own agenda and his knowledge of what lurked beneath the ocean depths added complications that transformed the venture into something far more perilous than anticipated. The preparation for this fishing expedition required equipment scaled to accommodate both Thor's divine strength and the enormous size of the sea creatures they hoped to catch. Hymir's boat, constructed from materials that could withstand the stresses generated by supernatural fishing techniques, was large enough to serve as a floating platform for major combat operations, while remaining maneuverable enough to navigate the treacherous waters where the larger sea creatures made their homes. The fishing lines were woven from materials that combined the strength of giant craftsmanship with magical enhancements that prevented them from breaking under the tremendous forces they would be required to bear. Thor's choice of bait for this expedition demonstrated both his determination to catch the largest possible prey and his willingness to take risks that other fishermen would consider suicidal. Rather than using conventional fish or meat as bait, the Thunder God selected the head of Himinhjota, Hymir's largest bull, a creature whose size and strength had made it legendary throughout the giant territories. This massive bovine head, still dripping with blood and retaining much of its life force, would prove irresistible to predators that normally ignored smaller offerings. But it would also attract attention from creatures that possessed the size and aggression to pose genuine threats to the fishermen themselves. The initial phase of their fishing expedition proceeded successfully, with both Thor and Hymir landing impressive catches that demonstrated their respective skills and the effectiveness of their equipment. The giant's experience with ocean fishing was evident in his ability to locate productive fishing grounds and his knowledge of the techniques required to land large sea creatures without damaging either the catch or the fishing gear. Thor's contributions to their success came through his supernatural strength, which allowed him to haul in creatures that would have been impossible for normal fishermen to manage, and his divine senses, which could detect underwater movement at distances that exceeded normal human capabilities. However, as they moved into deeper waters where the ocean floor dropped away into abyssal depths, their fishing activities began to attract attention from creatures that dwelt in the deepest parts of the sea. The scent of blood from their bait and the disturbances created by their fishing lines had spread throughout the underwater environment, alerting predators to the presence of potential prey on the surface. Among these creatures, none was more dangerous or more interested in the blood-soaked bull's head than Jormungandr itself, drawn from its usual resting place by the irresistible lure of fresh meat and the opportunity to confront the divine enemy whose presence it had sensed in the waters above. The serpent's approach to their fishing boat occurred with a stealth that belied its enormous size, as Jormungandr had learned to move through the ocean depths without creating the massive disturbances that would normally announce the presence of such a gigantic creature. Its intelligence, enhanced by centuries of growth and the magical energies that had shaped its development, allowed it to recognize the identity of the fisherman above and to plan its attack with calculated precision, designed to maximize the element of surprise while minimizing its own exposure to Thor's legendary hammer. When Jormungandr finally took the bait, the impact on Hymir's fishing boat was immediate and catastrophic. The fishing line, despite its supernatural strength, stretched to its absolute limits as the serpent's massive weight and powerful movements threatened to snap it or drag the entire vessel beneath the waves. The boat itself groaned and flexed under stresses that exceeded anything its giant constructor had anticipated, while the occupants found themselves engaged in a battle for survival that would test their combined strength against one of the most dangerous creatures in all the 9 worlds. Thor's initial response to the serpent's attack demonstrated both his combat instincts and his understanding of the unique challenges posed by fighting an aquatic opponent of such enormous proportions. His attempts to maintain control of the fishing line while preparing for direct combat required him to balance competing demands on his attention and physical capabilities, as losing his grip on the line would allow Jormungandr to escape back to the ocean depths, while abandoning the line would leave him without any means of controlling the serpent's movements during the battle that was about to commence. The Thunder God's efforts to haul the serpent to the surface created a spectacle that was visible from great distances, as the struggle between divine strength and monstrous resistance generated waves and atmospheric disturbances that affected weather patterns across multiple regions. The fishing line, stretched beyond its normal limits, began to emit sounds like thunder as the magical materials within its structure approached their breaking points, while the boat's hull creaked and groaned under forces that threatened to tear it apart despite its supernatural construction. Hymir's reaction to the unfolding battle revealed both his recognition of the extreme danger they faced and his understanding that their survival depended entirely on Thor's ability to either defeat or escape from the monster that had taken their bait. The giant's experience with ocean fishing had familiarized him with many dangerous sea creatures, but nothing in his background had prepared him for a confrontation with Jormungandr itself. His knowledge of the serpent's capabilities and his awareness of the prophetic significance of this encounter filled him with terror that transcended normal fear of physical danger. As Thor continued his efforts to drag Jormungandr toward the surface, the serpent's resistance intensified in ways that demonstrated both its immense physical power and its sophisticated understanding of aquatic combat tactics. Rather than simply pulling against the fishing line, the monster began to employ its coils and swimming techniques to create additional leverage that multiplied the effective force of its resistance. Its movements through the water generated currents and pressure waves that threatened to capsize their boat, while also creating underwater disturbances that attracted other dangerous sea creatures to the area. The moment when Jormungandr's head finally broke the ocean surface marked the climax of one of the most dangerous encounters in Norse mythology, as Thor found himself face to face with the cosmic enemy whose destruction was prophetically linked to his own death. The serpent's appearance above the waves revealed the full extent of its growth since its exile to the ocean depths, with a head the size of a mountain and eyes that burned with intelligence and malevolent purpose that exceeded anything the Thunder God had previously encountered in his battles against monstrous opponents. The serpent's venomous breath, released in clouds of toxic vapor that killed marine life for miles around the battle site, created an immediate threat to both fishermen that required Thor to adapt his combat strategy to account for environmental hazards as well as direct physical attacks. The poison clouds that surrounded Jormungandr's head made close-range combat extremely dangerous, even for divine constitution, while the creature's massive size meant that conventional weapon strikes would have minimal effect against its armoured scales and enormous bulk. Thor's attempt to strike Jormungandr with Mjolnir while maintaining his grip on the fishing line presented tactical challenges that pushed his combat skills to their absolute limits. The hammer's flight path had to account for the serpent's movements, the boat's instability, and the interference created by the poisonous atmosphere surrounding their opponent, while the Thunder God himself had to maintain his balance on a vessel that was being tossed about by waves generated by the monsters' thrashing movements. The critical moment of their confrontation arrived when Thor raised Mjolnir for what appeared to be the decisive strike that would either destroy Jormungandr or drive it back to the ocean depths. But Hymir's terror overcame his judgment, and he cut the fishing line with his knife, allowing the serpent to escape before the thunder god could complete his attack. This intervention, motivated by the giant's fear that Thor's success in killing the world serpent would trigger immediate cosmic catastrophe, prevented what might have been a premature resolution to one of the central conflicts of Norse mythology, while ensuring that the prophesied final battle between these eternal enemies would occur as fate had decreed. The aftermath of this encounter left both combatants with enhanced understanding of their opponent's capabilities and renewed awareness of the cosmic significance of their destined conflict. Thor had demonstrated his ability to force Jormungandr to surface, and had come within striking distance of landing what might have been a fatal blow, proving that the serpent was not invulnerable despite its enormous size and aquatic advantages. Jormungandr had shown that it possessed not only the physical power to challenge Thor directly, but also the intelligence and tactical awareness necessary to make their eventual confrontation a battle between equals rather than a simple contest of strength versus size. The prophetic implications of their fishing expedition encounter resonated throughout both divine and giant communities as news of the battle spread across the 9 worlds. The fact that Thor had successfully brought the world serpent to the surface demonstrated that the final confrontation prophesied for Ragnarok was not merely theoretical, but represented a genuine possibility that could occur whenever circumstances brought these eternal enemies together under appropriate conditions. The knowledge that their mutual destruction was not only prophetically certain, but practically achievable added urgency to the cosmic preparations that both sides were making for the approaching twilight of the gods. The reputation that Thor had earned through his countless victories against giants, monsters, and cosmic threats inevitably attracted challenges from beings who sought to test themselves against the thunder god's legendary prowess, creating a continuous stream of contests, trials, and confrontations that served to validate his status, while occasionally revealing the limitations of pure strength when confronted with cunning opponents. These encounters range from straightforward displays of physical power to complex tests that required not only might but wisdom, patience, and the ability to recognize when brute force alone would prove insufficient to achieve victory. The nature of these challenges reflected the diverse motivations of those who sought to measure themselves against Thor's capabilities. Some opponents were driven by genuine curiosity about the extent of divine power and their own potential to match or exceed it through supernatural abilities or magical enhancements. Others sought to establish their own reputations by defeating or at least surviving encounters with the most formidable warrior in Asgard, understanding that success against Thor would elevate their status throughout the 9 worlds, regardless of the specific circumstances of their confrontation. Certain challengers approached Thor with more complex agendas that involved testing not only his physical capabilities, but his judgment, character, and ability to adapt to unfamiliar situations. These encounters often took the form of elaborate scenarios designed to reveal aspects of the thunder god's nature that might not be apparent during conventional combat, creating opportunities for opponents to exploit psychological or tactical advantages that could compensate for their inferior strength or magical abilities. The challenge posed by the dwarf Alvis represented one of the most intellectually demanding tests that Thor ever faced, requiring him to employ wit and cunning rather than physical force to protect his daughter Thruda from an unwanted marriage that had been arranged through supernatural means. Alvis, whose name meant all-wise, possessed knowledge that encompassed virtually every aspect of existence across the 9 worlds, making him one of the most learned beings in creation despite his relatively modest physical stature and lack of combat prowess. The dwarf's suit for Thruda's hand in marriage was not based on romantic attraction or political alliance, but stemmed from his recognition that union with Thor's daughter would provide him with access to divine bloodlines and magical capabilities that could enhance his own supernatural abilities. His extensive knowledge and his reputation for wisdom had convinced him that intellectual superiority should take precedence over physical strength in determining worthiness for such a prestigious match, leading him to approach Thor with confidence that his scholarly achievements would prove more valuable than martial prowess. Alvis had apparently secured some form of preliminary agreement for the marriage during Thor's absence on one of his extended campaigns against giant threats, taking advantage of the Thunder God's unavailability to negotiate with other divine authorities who lacked both the personal investment in Thruda's welfare and the intimate knowledge of her preferences that would have made them more cautious about approving such an arrangement. The specific details of how this agreement had been reached remained unclear, but the dwarf's confidence in his legal position suggested that he possessed documentation or witnesses that supported his claim to have fulfilled whatever requirements had been established for winning the goddess's hand. Thor's return to discover this arrangement created a situation that tested his diplomatic skills as much as his protective instincts, since direct rejection of a legitimately negotiated marriage contract could create legal and political complications that might prove more troublesome than the original problem. The Thunder God's initial impulse to simply refuse the dwarf's suit had to be tempered by considerations of divine law and the potential consequences of arbitrary rejection of agreements that had been properly concluded according to established procedures. The solution that Thor devised for this dilemma demonstrated his understanding that intellectual challenges could sometimes be resolved through tactics that exploited the challenger's own expertise against them. Rather than rejecting Alvis's suit outright or resorting to threats of physical violence, the Thunder God proposed a test of the dwarf's claimed wisdom that would allow him to demonstrate his intellectual superiority while creating opportunities for more subtle forms of intervention if direct confrontation proved unnecessary. The contest that Thor proposed involved a comprehensive examination of Alvis's knowledge about the various names and terms used to describe common phenomena across different realms and among different peoples of the 9 worlds. This seemingly academic exercise actually served multiple purposes, as it would verify the dwarf's claims about his universal knowledge, while also providing Thor with time to develop alternative strategies for preventing the unwanted marriage if the intellectual challenge proved insufficient to discourage his opponent. The questioning began with relatively straightforward inquiries about terminology used in different realms to describe basic elements and natural phenomena, allowing Alvis to demonstrate his extensive learning while establishing the parameters for increasingly complex questions that would test the true depth and breadth of his knowledge. The dwarf's responses revealed not only his familiarity with the various languages and cultural traditions of different peoples, but also his understanding of the underlying concepts and relationships that connected seemingly disparate naming conventions across multiple realms. As the examination progressed, Thor's questions became increasingly specific and esoteric, requiring Alvis to draw upon the most obscure aspects of his accumulated knowledge, while demonstrating his understanding of subtle distinctions and regional variations that even well-educated beings might not recognize. The dwarf's continued success in providing accurate and comprehensive answers confirmed his reputation for wisdom, while also revealing the extent to which he had dedicated his existence to the accumulation and organization of information from every possible source. The Thunder God's strategy during this extended questioning session involved more than simply testing Alvis's knowledge. He was deliberately prolonging the encounter, while carefully monitoring the passage of time and the changing position of celestial bodies that would soon create conditions favourable to his ultimate plan. His questions were designed not only to challenge the dwarf's expertise, but to maintain his complete attention and engagement, preventing him from noticing environmental changes that would prove crucial to the contest's resolution. Thor's inquiries covered an impressive range of topics that demonstrated his own considerable knowledge, while revealing the interconnected nature of wisdom across different realms and cultures. questions about the various names for earth, sky, wind, fire and water led to more complex discussions of how different peoples understood and categorized natural phenomena, while inquiries about divine and supernatural terminology revealed the extent to which religious and magical concepts varied among different communities throughout the Nine Worlds. The dwarf's responses to these challenges showcase not only his factual knowledge, but his analytical abilities and his understanding of the deeper principles that govern the relationships between different naming systems and cultural traditions. His explanations often included historical context that revealed how terminology had evolved over time, and how contact between different peoples had influenced the development of shared or contrasting conceptual frameworks for understanding reality. As the questioning continued through the night hours, Alvis became increasingly absorbed in the intellectual challenge and the opportunity to display his comprehensive learning before such a distinguished audience. His enthusiasm for demonstrating his expertise prevented him from maintaining awareness of his surroundings and the passage of time, creating exactly the conditions that Thor had hoped to achieve through his prolonged examination strategy. The Thunder God's questions gradually shifted toward topics that required increasingly detailed explanations and complex analysis, ensuring that Alvis would remain fully engaged with providing comprehensive answers, rather than monitoring external conditions that might affect the outcome of their encounter. Inquiries about the relationships between different mythological systems and the variations in divine hierarchies across different cultures required extensive responses that consumed significant amounts of time while maintaining the dwarf's complete attention. Thor's strategy proved successful when the first rays of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, creating the environmental conditions necessary for the resolution he had planned from the beginning of their extended conversation. The dwarf's supernatural nature, which had provided him with his extensive knowledge and intellectual capabilities, also made him vulnerable to specific environmental factors that could neutralize his advantages and render his wisdom irrelevant to the practical outcome of their contest. The transformation that overcame Alvis as sunlight struck his form was both swift and irreversible, as his dwarven nature made him subject to the ancient curse that turned his kind to stone when exposed to direct solar radiation. His extensive knowledge and intellectual superiority proved powerless against this fundamental aspect of his supernatural constitution, demonstrating that even the greatest wisdom could be rendered useless when confronted with the right combination of circumstances and tactical awareness. The dwarf's petrification occurred in the midst of one of his most elaborate explanations, leaving him frozen in stone while still maintaining the posture and expression of someone engaged in scholarly discourse. This permanent transformation not only resolved the immediate problem of his unwanted suit for Thruda's hand, but also served as a lasting reminder of the importance of maintaining awareness of one's environment and limitations even during moments of intellectual triumph. Thor's success in this encounter demonstrated his ability to employ strategic thinking and patient planning when circumstances made direct confrontation inappropriate or unnecessarily destructive. His willingness to engage in extended intellectual discourse, despite his preference for more straightforward approaches to problem-solving, revealed the breadth of his capabilities and his understanding that different types of challenges required different types of responses. The resolution of the Alvis incident also highlighted the complex relationship between knowledge and practical wisdom that characterized many of Thor's encounters with intellectually gifted opponents. While the dwarf's extensive learning was genuine and impressive, his failure to consider the practical implications of prolonged nocturnal activity revealed limitations in his judgment that ultimately proved more significant than his scholarly achievements. This encounter established a pattern that would characterize many of Thor's subsequent trials, where opponents who possessed supernatural abilities or extensive knowledge would challenge him in ways that required adaptation of his usual combat-oriented approach to problem-solving. These experiences contributed to the development of his tactical sophistication and his understanding that, Effective leadership sometimes required subtlety and patience rather than immediate application of overwhelming force. The lessons learned from the Olvis encounter proved valuable during subsequent challenges that tested different aspects of Thor's character and capabilities. His growing reputation for both physical prowess and tactical intelligence attracted opponents who sought to exploit perceived weaknesses in his approach to various types of problems, creating opportunities for him to demonstrate the full range of his divine abilities, while also revealing areas where continued development might prove beneficial. One such challenge came from a giant wrestler named Ellie, whose appearance as an elderly woman masked supernatural strength and grappling techniques that had never been defeated by any opponent regardless of their size, strength, or combat experience. This encounter occurred during a feast where various beings had gathered to test their abilities against each other in friendly competition, creating an atmosphere where refusing challenges might be interpreted as cowardice or acknowledgement of inadequacy. Ellie's challenge to Thor appeared almost insulting in its apparent mismatch between the opponents, as her advanced age and frail appearance suggested that the contest would be over within moments of its commencement. The gathered spectators expected to witness a brief demonstration of divine strength, followed by respectful acknowledgement of Thor's superiority, but the actual wrestling match revealed capabilities that challenged every assumption about the relationship between physical appearance and combat effectiveness. The wrestling techniques that Ellie employed during their contest drew upon principles that transcended normal understanding of leverage, balance, and force application. Her movements seemed to flow like water around Thor's attacks, while simultaneously applying pressure and positioning that gradually undermined his stability and control. Despite his overwhelming advantages in size, strength, and combat experience, the Thunder God found himself being systematically outmaneuvered by an opponent whose methods operated according to rules that his extensive training had not prepared him to counter. As their wrestling match progressed, Thor's growing frustration with his inability to gain decisive advantage revealed the extent to which his confidence had been based on assumptions about the relationship between divine power and combat effectiveness. His repeated attempts to employ techniques that had proven successful against giants, monsters, and other supernatural opponents failed to achieve the expected results against an adversary whose capabilities seemed to exist outside the normal parameters that governed physical confrontation. The contest's conclusion, with Thor forced to acknowledge defeat despite his best efforts, provided valuable insights into the nature of power and the importance of recognizing when opponents possessed capabilities that transcended conventional understanding. Ellie's revelation of her true identity as the personification of old age itself explained her victory, while also demonstrating that some forces in the universe operated according to principles that even divine strength could not overcome through direct application. These encounters with opponents who challenged Thor through unconventional means contributed to his development as both a warrior and a leader, teaching him to recognize the limitations of pure strength while expanding his understanding of the various forms that power could take throughout the 9 worlds. His willingness to accept defeat gracefully when faced with superior opponents demonstrated the maturity and wisdom that complemented his physical capabilities, creating a more complete picture of his character than would have been possible through victories alone. The accumulation of these diverse experiences prepared Thor for the increasingly complex challenges that would characterize the approaching twilight of the gods, when conventional approaches to problem-solving would prove insufficient against enemies who combined physical threats with sophisticated strategic planning and supernatural abilities that operated outside the normal rules governing divine and mortal existence. The prophetic texts known as the Voluspa and other sources of ancient Norse wisdom painted a detailed picture of Thor's destined role during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods that would mark the end of the current cosmic cycle and the destruction of the ordered universe that the Aesir had spent millennia creating and maintaining. These prophecies, woven into the fabric of fate by the Norns themselves, described Thor not merely as a participant in the final battle but as one of its central figures, whose actions would determine the outcome of specific conflicts while simultaneously sealing his own doom through the very victories that would preserve what remained of creation for future renewal. The cosmic significance of Thor's prophesied role extended far beyond his individual fate to encompass the fundamental principles that had governed his entire existence as the defender of divine order. Throughout his career, he had served as the primary bulwark against the forces of chaos that constantly pressed against the boundaries of civilized existence, wielding Mjolnir to destroy threats before they could mature into existential dangers for gods and mortals alike. During Ragnarok, this protective function would reach its ultimate expression as Thor faced enemies whose victory would mean not merely the conquest of Asgard, but the complete dissolution of the structured cosmos into the primordial chaos from which it had originally emerged. The prophecies described Thor's participation in the final battle as both inevitable and essential, since his unique combination of divine power and earthborn heritage made him the only being capable of confronting certain cosmic threats that would emerge during the Twilight period. His strength, enhanced by Megingjord and channeled through Mjolnir, represented the concentrated force of divine order itself, while his connection to Jord provided him with the stability and endurance necessary to withstand the entropic forces that would seek to unmake the very foundations of reality during the cosmic upheaval. The approach of Ragnarok would be heralded by a series of signs and portents that Thor would recognize as indicators that the final confrontation was imminent. The Fimbulwinter, a prolonged period of harsh weather and social chaos, would test his ability to maintain protective oversight of human communities while cosmic forces gathered for their ultimate assault on the ordered world. During this time, his responsibilities would multiply as traditional sources of stability failed and mortal populations turned increasingly to divine intervention for survival against both natural disasters and supernatural threats. The breakdown of cosmic order that characterized the prelude to Ragnarok would manifest in ways that directly challenged Thor's protective capabilities and forced him to prioritize his responses to multiple simultaneous crises. The barriers between different realms would weaken, allowing hostile forces to move freely between territories that had previously been separated by divine authority and natural law. Giants would emerge from Jotunheim in unprecedented numbers, while monsters that had been contained or dormant for centuries would awaken to join the assault against the forces of order. Thor's strategic position during these preliminary conflicts would require him to balance immediate tactical necessities against longer-term considerations about conserving his strength for the ultimate confrontation that prophecy had foretold. His battles during the approach to Ragnarok would serve both as defensive actions to protect vulnerable populations and as preparation for the final encounter with Jormungandr, whose emergence from the ocean depths would signal the beginning of the cosmic battle's decisive phase. The World Serpent's role in Ragnarok had been established since the moment of its birth, when prophetic vision revealed that this offspring of Loki would grow to encompass the entire world and would ultimately face Thor in combat that would result in both their deaths. Jormungandr's preparation for this final confrontation involved more than simply growing to enormous size. The serpent had spent centuries developing its venomous capabilities and perfecting the combat techniques that would allow it to match Thor's divine power despite the fundamental differences in their nature and fighting styles. The serpent's emergence from the ocean during Ragnarok would create environmental catastrophes that would reshape the geography of Midgard and eliminate many of the human settlements that Thor had spent his existence protecting. The massive waves generated by Jormungandr's movement from the ocean depths to the battlefield would flood coastal regions and river valleys, while the poisonous atmosphere created by its breath would kill vegetation and wildlife across vast areas of the mortal realm. These preliminary effects of the serpent's approach would serve as both weapons against Thor's allies and demonstrations of the creature's power. The battlefield chosen for their final confrontation would reflect the cosmic significance of their encounter, taking place in a location where the boundaries between different realms had been weakened by the ongoing collapse of universal order. This setting would provide both combatants with access to the full range of their capabilities, while ensuring that their battle would have immediate consequences for the survival of creation itself. The outcome of their fight would determine not only their individual fates, but the extent to which the forces of chaos would succeed in their ultimate goal of returning the universe to primordial undifferentiation. Thor's approach to this final battle would demonstrate the culmination of his development as both warrior and cosmic guardian, combining the straightforward courage that had characterized his earliest adventures with the tactical sophistication and strategic awareness that he had gained through centuries of experience. His preparation would involve not only ensuring that his divine artifacts were functioning at peak effectiveness, but also making arrangements for the continuation of his protective role through his sons Modi and Magni, whose survival beyond Ragnarok had been prophesied and whose inheritance of his essential nature would be crucial for the post-apocalyptic world. The actual confrontation between Thor and Jormungandr would unfold as a battle between fundamentally different types of power, with the Thunder God's concentrated divine force meeting the Serpent's dispersed but overwhelming presence in combat that tested the absolute limits of both participants. Thor's initial attacks would employ the full range of his capabilities, with Mjolnir's lightning strike seeking to penetrate the Serpent's armoured scales, while his enhanced strength attempted to grapple with a creature whose coils could encircle mountains and whose length exceeded the boundaries of normal spatial understanding. Jormungandra's response to Thor's assault would reveal the sophisticated combat intelligence that the Serpent had developed during its long exile in the ocean depths. Rather than relying solely on its massive size and physical strength, the creature would employ tactical maneuvers that took advantage of its flexibility and reach, while using its venomous breath as both weapon and defensive barrier. The Serpent's ability to strike from multiple directions simultaneously would challenge Thor's combat reflexes and force him to adapt his usual direct approach to account for an opponent whose attacks could come from any angle. The battle's progression would demonstrate both combatants' understanding that this encounter represented the culmination of their eternal enmity and their final opportunity to achieve victory over their cosmic opposite. Thor's attacks would intensify as he recognized that conventional combat techniques were insufficient against an opponent of Jormungandra's scale and capabilities, forcing him to employ increasingly desperate measures that pushed his divine power beyond its normal limits. His willingness to sacrifice his own safety for the chance to destroy the world Serpent would reflect his recognition that the Serpent's survival would mean the end of everything he'd spent his existence protecting. The decisive moment of their confrontation would arrive when Thor succeeded in landing a killing blow with Mjolnir, driving the hammer deep into Jormungandra's skull with enough force to crush the Serpent's brain and sever its connection to the life force that had sustained its enormous body. This victory would represent the ultimate triumph of divine order over primordial chaos, confirming Thor's status as the supreme defender of cosmic stability, while simultaneously fulfilling the first half of the prophecy that had linked their fate since the Serpent's birth. However, Thor's victory over Jormungandr would prove to be Pyrrhic, as the Serpent's death throes would release the full concentration of venom that it had been accumulating throughout its existence in preparation for this final encounter. The poisonous cloud that emerged from the dying creature would be so toxic that even Thor's divine constitution would prove insufficient to withstand its effects, creating the conditions for the second half of their prophetic destiny to be fulfilled through the Thunder God's own death, mere moments after achieving his greatest victory. The manner of Thor's death would reflect both the heroic nature of his sacrifice and the tragic irony that characterized much of Norse mythology. His success in destroying the world Serpent would save creation from one of its most dangerous threats, but the cost of this victory would be his own life, claimed by the very enemy he had defeated. His final moments would be spent taking 9 steps away from Jormungandra's corpse, before succumbing to the Serpent's venom, a detail that emphasized both his tremendous endurance and the ultimately overwhelming nature of the poison that killed him. The cosmic significance of Thor's death would extend far beyond the loss of an individual deity to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of reality itself. His role as the active defender of divine order had been so central to the maintenance of cosmic stability that his absence would create a vacuum that no other being could fill, accelerating the collapse of universal structure that Ragnarok represented. The thunder and lightning that had been his to command would cease to protect mortal settlements from supernatural threats, while the psychological impact of his death would demoralize the remaining defenders of order and encourage the forces of chaos to press their advantage. Yet the prophecies that described Thor's death also spoke of continuation and renewal through his sons Modi and Magni, whose survival beyond the cosmic catastrophe would ensure that his essential nature and protective function would persist into the new world that would emerge from Ragnarok's destruction. These young gods had inherited not only their father's supernatural strength, but also his commitment to defending the innocent and maintaining cosmic order, making them the natural leaders of the divine community that would rebuild civilization after the old world's destruction. Modi's inheritance of his father's fierce courage and aggressive approach to confronting threats would make him particularly suited to dealing with the immediate challenges that would face the post-Ragnarok world, where survivors would need active protection against the remnants of chaotic forces that had participated in the cosmic battle. His willingness to engage any enemy, regardless of the odds, would provide the psychological leadership necessary to rally other survivors and begin the process of establishing new defensive structures to replace those that had been destroyed. Magni's inheritance of Thor's tremendous physical strength would prove equally crucial for the practical work of rebuilding that would occupy the survivors of Ragnarok. His ability to accomplish seemingly impossible feats through pure physical power would be essential for clearing away the debris of the old world and constructing the foundations of new settlements where the remaining population could establish secure communities. His strength would also serve as a deterrent against any hostile forces that might threaten the vulnerable rebuilding process. The survival of Modi and Magni would ensure that Thor's legacy extended beyond his individual achievements to encompass the continuation of his protective role through a new generation of divine guardians. Their possession of his essential qualities, combined with their own unique capabilities and perspectives, would allow them to adapt his methods to the different conditions that would characterize the post-apocalyptic world while maintaining the fundamental commitment to defending order against chaos that had defined their father's existence. The new world that would emerge after Ragnarok would face different challenges than those that had threatened the previous cosmic cycle, requiring Thor's sons to develop new approaches to their inherited responsibilities while drawing upon the lessons and examples that their father's career had provided. Their success in establishing effective protective systems for the renewed creation would serve as the ultimate validation of Thor's sacrifice and the final fulfillment of his cosmic purpose. The prophetic accounts of Ragnarok consistently emphasized that the twilight of the gods was not merely an ending but a transformation that would clear away the accumulated corruption and stagnation of the old world to make space for renewed growth and development. Thor's death, while tragic in its immediate impact, would serve this larger purpose by removing the defensive structures that had become too rigid and established to adapt to changing cosmic conditions, allowing his sons to create more flexible and responsive systems of protection for the new age. In this way, Thor's final battle with Jormungandr represented both the culmination of his individual heroic journey and his ultimate contribution to the cosmic cycle of destruction and renewal that governed Norse understanding of universal development. His willingness to sacrifice his own life to destroy the world serpent embodied the principle that true heroism sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice, while his son's survival ensured that this sacrifice would serve constructive purposes rather than merely representing tragic loss. The Thunder God's legacy would thus extend far beyond the specific deeds and adventures that had characterized his active career to encompass the fundamental principles of courage, strength, and protective dedication that would guide the rebuilding of creation after Ragnarok's devastation. Through Modi and Magni, Thor's essential nature would continue to influence the development of the new world, ensuring that the values and commitments that had defined his existence would remain active forces in shaping the future of divine and mortal communities alike. In death, as in life, Thor would continue to serve as the defender of cosmic order, his sacrifice becoming the foundation upon which a better world could be built from the ashes of the old.